Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity slows its pace, thoughts settle gently, and big questions are allowed to stretch out without needing quick answers. This is a place for winding down, for letting science, history and imagination mingle quietly while the world outside eases into the background. Wherever you are right now, whether it's early evening, late at night, or somewhere in between, you're very welcome here. Tonight we're going to explore a thought that may sound a little strange at first, but the longer it lingers, the harder it is to ignore. It's a question that slips in sideways rather than knocking at the door, and once you notice it, it tends to stay with you. The idea is simple on the surface, but it opens into something much larger the more you sit with it. What if humanity's greatest empire didn't collapse the way we've always been told? What if it didn't crumble, scatter and vanish into history? What if it simply stepped out of sight? History, as we usually learn it, has a familiar rhythm. Civilizations rise, reach a peak, and then fall. There's a beginning, a middle, and an ending. Textbooks like neat conclusions. Timelines prefer clean breaks. One date marks the height of power, another marks the collapse, and everything after becomes aftermath. We imagine ruins slowly overtaken by weeds, languages fading into silence, knowledge lost or fragmented, and people moving on to whatever comes next. It's a comforting structure in a way. It suggests that even the biggest things are temporary, that everything eventually resolves into an ending we can point to. But history is written on the surface of things. It relies on what remains visible. Coins, buildings, records, monuments, stories passed down by those who stayed above ground. It tells us what can be seen, measured and excavated. It doesn't always tell us what was hidden, or what chose not to leave traces that were easy to find, and it rarely accounts for deliberate disappearance. Imagine for a moment an empire at the height of its reach, not just powerful in the obvious ways like armies and territory, but advanced in organisation, engineering, logistics and long-term planning. An empire that understands supply chains, population pressures, environmental limits, and the slow warning signs of instability. An empire capable of looking at its own future and realising that remaining visible might be the most dangerous choice of all. What if, instead of fighting decline in public view, instead of stretching itself thinner and thinner across the surface of the world, that empire chose something else entirely? Not conquest, not collapse, withdrawal. A planned retreat, not upward into the skies, but downward into the ground beneath their feet, away from borders, away from invaders, away from the unpredictable churn of surface history. It sounds dramatic when framed that way, but human beings have always gone underground when conditions demanded it. We've carved shelters into rock to survive heat, cold, war and scarcity. We've stored food, water and knowledge below ground because it lasts longer there. We've hidden when hiding was the only sensible option. The difference here is scale and tension, not a temporary refuge, but a permanent shift. Not survival during a crisis, but continuity across centuries. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently, the way these stories often begin. Where are you listening from right now? Not just geographically, but situationally. Are you stretched out somewhere comfortable, lights dimmed, day mostly behind you? Or are you listening while something else quietly hums along in the background? And what time is it for you, in your own corner of the world? It's always interesting, isn't it, to think about time and place when discussing things that may have moved through both very differently than we imagine. If you find this kind of slow exploration soothing, or if you enjoy letting big ideas unfold at an unhurried pace, you're very welcome to like the video or subscribe. It helps this quiet space reach others who might also enjoy a calmer way of thinking about the world. There's no rush, though. Nothing here is demanding your attention. It's simply offering a place to rest your thoughts for a while. Now let's ease back into the idea itself, without trying to prove anything yet, without trying to solve the puzzle all at once. Just consider the question, and let it sit there. What would it actually mean for an empire to go underground? Not metaphorically, but literally. What kinds of decisions would lead to that outcome? What problems would it solve? And what new problems would it create? One of the assumptions we carry about empires is that they want to be seen. Power announces itself. Flags are raised, buildings are tall, roads stretch outward like veins. Influence is visible, measurable, undeniable. But visibility is also vulnerability. Everything on the surface is exposed to weather, erosion, invasion, rebellion, and the slow unpredictability of generations that may not share the same priorities as their ancestors. Going underground removes many of those risks at once. Temperature stabilizes, structures last longer, food can be stored more safely, populations can be controlled with greater precision. Even time itself behaves differently underground, where days and seasons lose their dominance over daily life. It's no accident that some of the longest-lasting human structures are subterranean. They are protected by the very thing that hides them. There's also the matter of attention. Empires fall not only because of external pressure, but because everyone knows where they are. Rivals watch them, enemies study them. Success attracts imitation and resistance in equal measure. Disappearing removes that constant gaze. It allows change to happen slowly, without being challenged at every step. It allows mistakes to be corrected quietly, rather than punished publicly. Of course, disappearing on that scale would require extraordinary coordination. Entire populations don't simply vanish without planning. Infrastructure would need to be built long before the move. Supply systems would have to be redundant and resilient. Cultural narratives would need to shift so people understood the purpose of leaving the surface behind. Perhaps most importantly, the above-ground world would need a convincing story about what happened. A collapse, a defeat, a gradual fading that looked believable enough to satisfy future historians. And history is remarkably easy to misdirect when the evidence left behind supports the story you want told. Burned cities, abandoned roads, broken statues. These can mean defeat, or they can mean intentional dismantling. Records can be lost accidentally, or they can be curated selectively. What remains above ground doesn't have to be the whole truth. It only has to be enough to end the questions. What's interesting is how often archaeology runs into gaps that feel strangely deliberate. Sudden changes in building styles, technologies that appear fully formed with no clear development path, cities that seem to empty out faster than population decline would suggest, underground structures that are far more extensive than their supposed use would require. None of these prove anything on their own, but together they raise eyebrows. They hint at planning rather than chaos. Consider how many ancient underground cities exist that challenge simple explanations. Vast networks carved into stone complete with ventilation, water access, storage rooms, living quarters, and escape routes. Some of these could house tens of thousands of people for extended periods. They weren't emergency shelters in the casual sense. They were carefully engineered environments, designed for long-term occupation. And yet, we often treat them as curiosities, side notes in history, rather than central clues. It's also worth thinking about how history favours the surface, because that's where modern researchers live. We dig downward, but only so far, only where funding, technology, and interest align. Entire regions beneath our feet remain unexplored, not because they're inaccessible, but because we assume there's nothing left to find. Our expectations shape our investigations. Now imagine an empire that understood this tendency. An empire that knew future civilizations would focus on ruins, inscriptions, and monuments left above ground. An empire that realized the safest place to preserve itself wasn't behind walls or across oceans, but beneath layers of soil and assumption. Time becomes an ally when you're hidden. Every generation above ground moves further away from the truth, not closer. Living underground would change society in profound ways. Architecture would become functional rather than symbolic. Hierarchies might flatten when space is limited and cooperation is essential. Resources would be managed differently. Waste would need to be recycled efficiently. Energy would likely be conserved rather than expanded, progress would be measured in stability, not growth. Children born into such a world wouldn't experience it as hiding. It would simply be home. Stories of the surface might become distant legends, warnings, or curiosities. The sky could turn into a concept rather than a daily presence. Light would be something controlled and intentional, not something that arrives on its own schedule. Time itself might be marked differently, not by sunrises, but by cycles of work, rest, and maintenance. Above ground, meanwhile, the world would continue. New empires would rise, old languages would die, borders would shift, wars would be fought over land that had already been quietly abandoned. History would keep telling its familiar story of rise and fall, unaware that one of its greatest characters had simply stepped out of frame. The idea isn't that this hidden civilization would be watching every surface event, waiting to return dramatically. That's a very modern narrative instinct. It's more likely that if such a society existed, it would be focused inward. Survival, continuity, and gradual adaptation would matter more than reclaiming lost glory. Returning to the surface might not even be a goal. It might be a risk best avoided. Still, traces would remain. Small ones, unexplained ones. Technologies that seem to leap forward without clear ancestors. Myths about people who live below. Persistent rumours of sealed tunnels, restricted zones, and places that don't quite match the surrounding landscape. These wouldn't form a clear picture, but they wouldn't disappear either. For now, there's no need to decide whether this is true or not. There's no need to label it as history, speculation, or something in between. Just let the idea sit with you, the way a question does when it doesn't demand an immediate answer. History, after all, is full of things that made no sense until they did. And sometimes the most interesting stories aren't the ones that ended loudly, but the ones that learned how to remain very, very quiet. When people think about empires that are gone, they usually picture something very specific. Crumbling stone, half-buried roads, fragments of writing that stop mid-sentence, as if history itself lost interest and walked away. There's a sense of finality built into that image. An empire rises, reaches its height, then collapses under its own weight or the pressure of others, and what's left becomes a lesson. We're taught to see these endings as inevitable, almost comforting in their predictability. Nothing lasts forever. Power fades, time wins. But that idea relies heavily on what disappearance is supposed to look like. We assume that when something ends, it does so noisily. That decline must be visible. That if an empire were still around in any meaningful way, we would see clear evidence of it above ground, in the open, waiting to be catalogued. It's a very surface-level assumption, and it shapes how we interpret everything that came before us. Take one of the great empires most people learn about early on. It appears in textbooks with maps shaded in bold colours, borders expanding and contracting across centuries. We learn about its laws, its engineering, its armies, its cultural reach. Then, at some point, the shading stops. The narrative shifts tone. Words like decline, decay, and fall begin to appear more often. There's usually a date attached, or at least a century, marking the moment it supposedly ended. After that, the story moves on. What's rarely examined closely is how clean that ending actually was. Empires don't evaporate overnight. Administrations don't vanish in a single generation. Knowledge doesn't simply forget itself. And populations, especially large organised ones, don't all disperse in the same direction at the same time unless something is guiding that movement. When historians talk about an empire being gone, what they often mean is that its visible, political structure no longer controls territory on the surface. Its coins stop being minted, its official records dry up, its monumental building projects cease. From the outside, it looks like absence. But absence of evidence is not the same thing as evidence of absence, especially when you're dealing with societies capable of planning across centuries rather than election cycles. It's worth pausing on that idea for a moment. Long-term planning is something we like to think of as modern, but it isn't. Ancient societies planned irrigation systems that took generations to complete. They built roads meant to last hundreds of years. They established legal codes intended to outlive the people who wrote them. These were not short-sighted cultures. They understood continuity. They understood that survival often depended on thinking far beyond the present moment. Now imagine such a society facing pressures it can no longer manage openly. Environmental strain, overextended borders, internal unrest, external threats that multiply rather than resolve. At some point, expansion stops being a strength and starts becoming a liability. Every new border adds another place that needs defending. Every public institution becomes another target. Visibility, once a sign of power, becomes an invitation. At that stage, collapse is only one option. It's the one we're most familiar with because it's dramatic and easy to record. But it's not the only possible response. Another option is consolidation, pulling inward, reducing exposure, preserving what matters most while letting go of what draws attention. From the outside, that can look exactly like a fall. Armies withdraw, public works decay, trade routes shift. The surface world sees chaos and assumes incompetence or defeat. But from the inside, it can be something very different. A controlled contraction, a decision to abandon the stage rather than be dragged off it. This is where the idea of an empire everyone thought was gone starts to feel less like fantasy and more like a reframing of assumptions. We equate power with presence. When presence fades, we assume power has vanished too. But power doesn't always need to announce itself. In fact, some forms of power work best when they're invisible. There's also a bias in how history remembers winners and losers. The groups that stay visible get written about. The ones that withdraw quietly leave fewer narrators behind. Over time, the stories that survive are the ones told by those who remained above ground, adapting to new rulers, new languages, new systems. If an entire civilization chose to step away from that cycle, their version of events would not be part of the mainstream record. What we might see instead are inconsistencies, sudden drops in population that don't line up with evidence of mass death, cities that seem to empty without signs of destruction, administrative systems that stop issuing decrees even though the society using them clearly hasn't vanished overnight. These moments tend to be explained away as confusion, poor record keeping, or gradual decline. But they could also point to something more intentional. Consider the logistical challenge of an empire truly collapsing. Food systems break down, supply chains fail, knowledge fragments, skills are lost. Yet in many cases we see technologies and practices continue smoothly into later periods, sometimes reappearing in places where they supposedly shouldn't exist anymore. It's as if the knowledge never disappeared, only changed hands or changed location. If an empire did choose to go underground, figuratively and literally, it would make sense for it to leave behind a convincing story of failure, not necessarily through deception in the modern sense, but through selective disengagement. Stop maintaining roads, let public buildings crumble, withdraw officials, allow borders to be overrun or redefined. Over time, the surface narrative writes itself. Above ground, new societies would move into the vacuum. They would reuse materials, repurpose ruins, reinterpret symbols. They would tell stories about the ancients who came before them, attributing greatness and mystery in equal measure. Over generations, those stories would harden into accepted history. The empire would be labelled as finished, its fate sealed. Meanwhile, below ground, continuity would look very different. Survival would depend less on expansion and more on balance. Population sizes would likely be controlled carefully. Resource use would need to be precise. Cultural change would still happen, but at a slower pace, shaped by isolation and long memory rather than constant contact with rivals. One of the reasons this idea feels unsettling is that it challenges the comfort we find in believing that all great powers eventually meet the same visible end. There's a moral lesson baked into that belief. Hubris leads to downfall. Complexity leads to collapse. But if an empire managed to avoid that fate by stepping aside rather than pushing forward, the lesson becomes murkier. It suggests that endurance might favour restraint over dominance. There's also the question of why such an empire would choose the underground specifically. The simplest answer is protection. Underground environments are naturally insulated from climate extremes. They're easier to defend. They preserve materials far longer than open air. But there's a deeper reason as well. Going underground isn't just about hiding from enemies. It's about hiding from time. Surface history is turbulent, borders shift, languages evolve rapidly, cultural memory is short. Underground, change slows. Traditions can be maintained with fewer interruptions. Knowledge can be passed down with less distortion. Time becomes something managed rather than endured. Of course, this kind of transition wouldn't happen overnight. It would likely take generations. Early phases might involve building subterranean infrastructure under the guise of storage, mining, or religious use. Over time, these spaces would expand, connect, and deepen. What began as contingency planning would slowly become a parallel world. From the surface, these developments might appear mundane or insignificant. Tunnels are dug. Chambers are carved. Nothing about that suggests an entire civilization preparing to relocate. It's only in hindsight, when viewed as a whole, that the scale becomes apparent. And by then, the people who understood the original intent would be long gone from the surface narrative. There's an interesting parallel here with how we think about disappearance in the modern world. When something stops appearing in news cycles, we often assume it no longer matters. But absence of attention doesn't equal absence of activity. Entire systems continue operating quietly, unseen, because they no longer need to advertise their existence. The same could apply to an ancient empire that chose discretion over display. Its influence might persist in subtle ways, inherited practices, architectural knowledge resurfacing centuries later, patterns of organisation that appear repeatedly in unrelated cultures. These would look like coincidences or rediscoveries, not continuity. And that's the key point. If an empire truly wanted to be thought of as gone, it wouldn't leave behind a clear trail. It wouldn't preserve its name or demand recognition. It would allow itself to become a myth, a cautionary tale, a footnote. The less seriously future generations took its survival, the safer that survival would be. There's something quietly clever about that strategy. History tends to stop looking for things it believes it has already explained. Once a civilization has been classified as fallen, research moves on to the next mystery. The idea that it might have chosen to vanish rather than fail rarely enters the conversation, because it doesn't fit the usual pattern. As we move forward, it's worth keeping that in mind. Not every silence means an ending. Not every ruin marks defeat. Sometimes what looks like disappearance is actually relocation. And sometimes the most enduring empires are the ones that learned how to leave the spotlight before it became a liability. This doesn't mean that everything beneath our feet is evidence of a hidden super-civilization. It means only that the story of the past may be less straightforward than we like to believe. The empire everyone thought was gone might not have ended its story where the textbooks say it did. It might have simply continued elsewhere, quietly adjusting to a world it no longer needed to dominate openly. And once you allow for that possibility, even tentatively, the familiar landscape of history starts to feel a little less settled. The gaps feel more intentional. The silences feel heavier. And the idea that disappearance can be a choice rather than a failure begins to open the door to questions that don't have easy answers, but are worth sitting with. When historians describe the collapse of an empire, the story often carries a sense of inevitability. There is a rhythm to it that feels familiar. Economic strain leads to political instability. Borders weaken, corruption spreads. Eventually something breaks, whether it's an invasion, a civil war, or a slow administrative failure that leaves the system hollowed out. It's a pattern we've seen repeated so often that we rarely question it. Collapse becomes not just an outcome, but an expectation. Yet when you look closely at certain historical endings, something begins to feel off. Not chaotic, not tragic in the way we're used to, but strangely orderly. Too orderly. Cities are abandoned without evidence of prolonged siege. Administrative systems cease abruptly rather than unravelling gradually. Infrastructure stops being maintained, but not because it was destroyed. It's simply left behind, intact enough to decay naturally, as if no one felt the need to use it anymore. That kind of neatness is unusual. True collapse is messy. It leaves layers of desperation behind. Hoarded goods, half-finished repairs, signs of scarcity and improvisation. When systems fail, suddenly and unintentionally, people scramble. They adapt poorly at first. They leave behind evidence of stress, not restraint. So when we encounter a historical transition that lacks these markers, it raises a quiet question. Was this really collapse, or was it something else wearing collapse's clothes? Consider how long it takes for complex systems to fail completely. Even under extreme pressure, bureaucracies linger. Officials keep issuing orders long after those orders stop being effective. Armies fracture rather than disappear. Taxes continue to be collected unevenly. Records grow sloppy, but they don't vanish overnight. The gears grind before they stop. Yet in some cases, the gears seem to stop turning almost politely. Coinage ceases to circulate. Official inscriptions end. Large public works projects are halted mid-cycle, not because materials ran out, but because there was no longer a reason to continue them. It's as if someone reached a collective decision point and quietly agreed that the effort was no longer necessary. One explanation often offered is administrative overreach. The system became too big, too complex, and it simply couldn't sustain itself. That may be true in part, but even then, complexity doesn't usually result in synchronized withdrawal. Different regions collapse at different speeds. Peripheral areas break away first. Core territories resist longer. You get fragmentation, not uniform silence. Uniform silence, however, is exactly what appears in some historical records. Communication stops across wide areas within a relatively narrow time frame. Not staggered, not region by region, but almost in unison. That kind of coordination suggests either extraordinary coincidence or deliberate choice. Another detail that complicates the collapse narrative is what doesn't happen afterward. After most empires fall, there is a period of visible struggle. Competing powers fight over the remains. Cities are reused aggressively. Existing infrastructure is cannibalized to fuel new ambitions. The ruins are noisy, full of activity, even if that activity is chaotic. But there are instances where former imperial centres remain oddly underutilized for long stretches of time. They're not destroyed. They're not fully reclaimed. They're simply there. It's tempting to interpret that as fear or superstition on the part of successor cultures. Maybe the ruins were seen as cursed or unstable, but that explanation doesn't hold consistently. Humans are practical. They reuse what works. They don't leave functional aqueducts or well-planned urban layouts untouched without a reason, especially when resources are scarce. One possible reason is that the population who knew how to maintain and operate those systems was no longer present. That fits collapse theory on the surface. But then we encounter another puzzle. Some of the specialized knowledge reappears later, sometimes far from its original source, and sometimes without a clear lineage. Techniques resurface as if remembered rather than reinvented. It's as though the knowledge never truly disappeared, only relocated. The neatness shows up in population data as well, where such data exists. Sudden drops without corresponding evidence of mass death. No widespread burial grounds. No signs of famine severe enough to account for the numbers. Migration is often cited, but migration on that scale usually leaves trails, temporary settlements, camps, layers of transition. In some cases, those layers are conspicuously thin. There's also the matter of timing. Collapses are often dated to specific years or decades, but those dates are usually based on the last known official record, not on evidence of systemic failure. When the paperwork stops, we assume the empire stopped too. But administrative silence can mean many things. It can mean chaos, or it can mean the administration no longer saw a reason to communicate with the outside world. From a strategic perspective, disappearing cleanly would require careful preparation. You wouldn't want to leave behind signs of panic. You wouldn't want desperate final measures that future observers could misinterpret. Instead, you would scale down gradually while maintaining the appearance of decay. You would let buildings age. You would allow roads to fall into disrepair naturally. You would stop replacing what breaks rather than smashing it yourself. That approach produces exactly the kind of archaeological footprint we associate with decline. The difference is intent. One is the result of failure, the other is the result of disengagement. What makes this idea uncomfortable is that it undermines one of history's favourite moral frameworks. Collapse is often framed as deserved. Empires grow arrogant, overreach, and are punished by reality. It's a tidy lesson. But disengagement is harder to moralise. It suggests foresight, restraint, and a willingness to abandon power before it becomes destructive. That doesn't fit neatly into the rise and fall narrative. It also raises questions about who gets to define success. If an empire measures success not by how long it dominates the surface world, but by how long it preserves its people, its knowledge, and its internal stability, then disappearance might be a logical outcome, not a failure. In that light, collapse becomes a story told by those left behind, not by those who left intentionally. There's an analogy here with modern institutions. When a company quietly shuts down a division and redirects its resources elsewhere, outsiders may interpret that as failure. Internally, it may be seen as optimization. The division didn't collapse, it was absorbed, transformed, or retired because it no longer served its purpose. Scale that thinking up to a civilization, and the possibility becomes less abstract. Another feature of suspiciously neat collapses is how well they align with environmental or social thresholds. Climate shifts, resource depletion, increasing population density. These pressures don't usually produce sudden endings, they produce long-term stress. If an empire recognised that the surface environment was becoming less reliable, retreating underground could be framed as adaptation rather than escape. In that case, the timing of withdrawal would matter. You wouldn't wait until famine or invasion forced your hand. You would act while you still had surplus, while you could choose who went and what was taken, while you could build infrastructure deliberately rather than in desperation. From the outside, it would look like decline setting in earlier than expected. From the inside, it would be a calculated pivot. This would also explain why some collapses appear oddly premature. Empires that seemed capable of continuing for centuries more, at least by military standards, suddenly stop expanding and then fade. The common explanation is internal rot. But rot leaves traces. It smells. It spreads unevenly. Strategic withdrawal, by contrast, can look clean, even elegant if you're not looking for it. One might argue that coordinating such a move across a vast population would be impossible without modern communication. But ancient societies were often more centralized than we assume. Religious calendars, legal obligations, and cultural rituals synchronized behavior across enormous distances. When an empire wanted people to move, they moved. Colonization efforts, military campaigns, and mass construction projects all demonstrate this capacity. If the directive was framed not as abandonment but as transition, compliance might even have been high, especially if the alternative was prolonged instability on the surface. Humans are remarkably willing to adapt when the narrative makes sense and the leadership appears confident. Another aspect that deserves attention is what happens to surface narratives after the fact. Once the empire is believed to be gone, later societies project their own assumptions onto the remains. Ruins become symbols of failure. Legends emphasize decadence and excess. Moral explanations fill the gaps where logistical ones are missing. Over time, these interpretations harden into accepted truth. It becomes difficult to question them, because doing so feels like challenging the foundation of historical understanding. But history is not a fixed object. It's a reconstruction based on what survives. If survival itself was selective, then our reconstructions inherit that bias. What we often call collapse may simply be the point where an empire stops participating in surface history. From that moment on, it no longer leaves the kind of evidence historians expect. It stops announcing itself. It stops explaining itself. And because we're conditioned to associate silence with death, we declare it gone. But silence can also mean privacy. As we think about collapses that feel too neat, it's important not to swing too far in the opposite direction. Not every empire that ended did so by choice. Many genuinely fell apart under pressure. Violence, mismanagement, and ecological collapse are very real forces. The point isn't that collapse never happens. It's that sometimes what we label as collapse may be misclassified because we're using the wrong criteria. The criteria we use are heavily influenced by visibility. We look for dramatic events, battles, sackings, plagues. We're less comfortable with quiet endings. They don't give us clear dates or villains. They don't fit into timelines as easily. But quiet endings are not uncommon in human affairs. People leave jobs, cities, and relationships quietly all the time, not because they failed, but because they no longer served a purpose. If a civilization reached that conclusion about its surface existence, the transition could easily be mistaken for decline, especially by those who remained behind or moved into the abandoned spaces later. To them, it would look like the world had ended. To those who left, it might have felt like a beginning. This reframing doesn't require assuming secret knowledge or fantastical technology. It only requires assuming that ancient people were capable of long-term thinking and collective decision-making, both of which we already know to be true. The question becomes less about whether collapse was real, and more about how we define it. Is collapse the loss of territory and visibility, or is it the loss of continuity and purpose? If continuity is preserved elsewhere, even out of sight, then perhaps what collapsed was only the surface expression, not the civilization itself. Choosing to disappear is not the same thing as giving up. In many ways, it is a far more demanding decision than fighting to remain visible at all costs. Collapse often happens when options have already run out. Disappearance, by contrast, requires foresight, discipline, and a willingness to let go of familiar forms of power. It asks a society to abandon symbols it spent generations building, not because they failed, but because they succeeded too loudly. When an empire reaches a certain scale, it begins to attract forces it can no longer fully control. Rivals organize themselves in response. Neighbors become dependent, resentful, or both. Internal systems grow rigid as they attempt to manage complexity through repetition rather than adaptation. At that point, maintaining the appearance of strength becomes a constant performance. Armies must march even when they are exhausted. Laws must be enforced even when they no longer serve their original purpose. The machinery keeps moving because stopping it publicly would signal weakness. Disappearance offers an alternative path. Instead of forcing the system to endure until it breaks, the system changes the rules of engagement entirely. It steps away from the arena rather than losing within it. From the outside, that looks like failure. From the inside, it can feel like relief. The decision to disappear would not be made lightly. It would emerge gradually through debates that never made it into official records, through concerns voiced quietly among planners, engineers, administrators, and leaders who understood the long arc of their society better than the myths it projected. They would see patterns repeating. Environmental strain that could not be solved through expansion alone. Social tensions that could not be resolved by new laws without constant enforcement. A growing gap between what the empire claimed to be and what it could realistically sustain. At some point, someone would ask a dangerous question. What if staying visible is the problem? What if the very structures that define us are the reason we're becoming fragile? What if survival no longer means growth, but withdrawal? That question would not appeal to everyone. Empires are built on ambition, and ambition rarely yields gracefully. There would be resistance from those whose power depended on visibility. Military leaders, regional governors, public officials whose authority existed only because people saw them exercising it. Disappearance would threaten their identity as much as their position, but empires are not governed by individuals alone. They are governed by systems, and systems can shift when enough of their internal logic no longer aligns with external reality. If maintaining the surface world required more energy than it returned, if every new generation had to fight harder just to keep things from getting worse, the calculus would begin to change. The choice to disappear would likely be framed not as abandonment, but as preservation. The narrative would focus on protecting what mattered most: people, knowledge, stability, continuity. Everything else would become negotiable. Borders could be lost, monuments could be sacrificed, even the empire's name could be allowed to fade if holding on to it increased risk. This kind of thinking requires a very different relationship with legacy. Most empires want to be remembered. They build to last, not just physically, but symbolically. Statues, inscriptions, grand public works are all messages to the future. We were here, we mattered. Disappearance asks a society to accept the opposite, to survive without being acknowledged, to trade memory for endurance. That trade only makes sense if survival itself is the priority, if the empire's leadership, broadly defined, believes that history's approval is less important than the well-being of those who will live centuries later. That belief is rare, but not impossible. It tends to emerge in cultures that value continuity over conquest, process over spectacle. There is also a practical advantage to disappearance that goes beyond philosophy. Visibility creates targets. Armies know where to march. Rivals know where to strike. Dissidents know where to gather. When a power structure vanishes from the surface, it removes itself from the immediate reach of conflict. Threats that rely on confrontation lose their leverage. Underground, or otherwise out of sight, a society can reorganize without interference. It can experiment with governance, resource management, and social norms in ways that would provoke backlash if done publicly. Mistakes can be corrected quietly. Reforms can be implemented gradually. There is time to learn, which is something collapsing societies rarely have. Disappearance also changes the pace of life. Surface empires operate on accelerated timelines. News travels fast. Decisions must be made quickly to respond to crises that are constantly visible. Underground or hidden from external pressure, time stretches. Problems are still addressed, but they're not amplified by spectacle. Urgency gives way to deliberation. That shift alone could stabilize a civilization facing long-term threats. Climate patterns, for example, do not respond to short-term fixes. Resource depletion cannot be solved by conquering new land indefinitely. A hidden society could focus on sustainability rather than growth, on balance rather than expansion. Of course, disappearance would come with costs. Leaving the surface behind would mean abandoning agricultural systems designed around sunlight. It would require new methods of food production, water management, and waste recycling. It would demand a level of technological sophistication and planning that goes beyond simple shelter building. These challenges are not trivial, but they are solvable with enough preparation. More difficult would be the cultural transition. People define themselves through shared stories, and those stories are often tied to place, sky, and history. Moving underground would mean redefining identity itself. What does it mean to belong to an empire that no longer exists in the world everyone else sees? What does loyalty look like when there are no banners, no parades, no public rituals of dominance? The answer would likely involve a shift toward internal markers of meaning, education, skill mastery, collective responsibility. In a hidden society, every individual's contribution matters more. There is less room for performative roles. Survival depends on cooperation rather than hierarchy alone. This could lead to a flattening of social structures over time, not necessarily equality in the modern sense, but a reduction in symbolic excess. When space is limited and resources are carefully managed, ostentation loses its appeal. Practical competence becomes more valuable than inherited status. Another aspect of disappearance that is often overlooked is choice itself. Collapse removes agency. It happens to people. Disappearance preserves it. Even if the circumstances are harsh, choosing how to respond maintains a sense of control. That psychological difference matters. It affects how societies adapt, how they tell their own story internally, and how they face uncertainty. For the people who remained on the surface, however, none of this would be visible. They would see institutions withdrawing, support systems failing, familiar structures decaying. Without access to the internal rationale, they would interpret these changes as incompetence or decay. Resentment would grow, stories of corruption and weakness would circulate. Over time, these narratives would solidify into history. This is where disappearance becomes self-reinforcing. The more the surface world believes the empire has fallen, the safer it becomes for the hidden society to remain hidden. Curiosity fades. Scholars move on. Future generations accept the story they inherit. There is also a strategic advantage in allowing others to inherit the surface. New powers would rise, compete, and exhaust themselves in familiar cycles. From below, these struggles would be background noise. The hidden society would not need to intervene. Time would do the work for them. It's tempting to imagine such a society as cold or detached, but that may not be accurate. Withdrawal does not require indifference. It requires prioritization. The surface world would still matter, but as an environment rather than a stage. Changes above ground could be observed and studied without the need to respond publicly. The choice to disappear would also influence how the society related to risk. Above ground, risk is often managed through force. Underground, force is a last resort. Avoidance becomes the primary strategy. If something cannot be controlled, it is circumvented rather than confronted. That mindset reduces the likelihood of catastrophic failure. Importantly, disappearance does not have to be total. The surface does not need to be abandoned entirely. Limited contact could be maintained through intermediaries, trade, or observation. But these interactions would be carefully managed to avoid drawing attention. The goal would not be influence, but awareness. Over generations, the original decision to disappear would likely become tradition rather than strategy. Children born into the hidden world would not experience it as retreat. It would simply be reality. Stories of the surface empire would feel distant, like myths of a time when things were done differently. The idea of returning might seem unnecessary, even reckless. And that is perhaps the most striking implication of choosing disappearance over collapse. It suggests that history, as we experience it, may be missing entire continuities. Civilizations that did not fail, but opted out. Societies that decided the surface was no longer the safest place to exist, and acted accordingly. This possibility doesn't require imagining secret rulers manipulating events above ground. It doesn't require omniscience or hidden dominance. It only requires acknowledging that survival strategies can be quieter than we expect, and that not all victories involve being seen. What does a civilization become when it removes itself from the glare of history? How does culture evolve without constant external pressure? And what kinds of spaces would such a society need to build to support not just survival, but life itself, over centuries spent out of sight? A city is usually defined by what rises above the ground. Towers, walls, streets, markets, rooftops catching sunlight. When we picture urban life, we imagine open spaces shaped by weather, noise carried on the air, people orienting themselves by landmarks that can be seen from a distance. It's a deeply ingrained image, one that makes it difficult to think of cities as anything else. But once a society commits to disappearing rather than falling, that definition no longer applies. The city has to change its relationship with the environment entirely, and nowhere is that change more profound than in how it learns to exist underground. Living underground is not the same as hiding in caves. Temporary shelters can rely on minimal systems. A civilization cannot. A true underground city has to function continuously, predictably and safely, not for days or months, but for generations. That means solving problems that surface cities rarely have to think about in isolation. Air must move deliberately. Water must be guided with precision. Waste cannot be allowed to accumulate. Heat, light, sound, and space all have to be managed intentionally rather than passively. The first challenge is air. On the surface, breathing is effortless because the atmosphere does most of the work. Underground, air becomes a responsibility. It has to be drawn in, circulated, refreshed and released without exposing the city's location or destabilizing its internal climate. This is where the idea of a city learning to breathe becomes literal rather than metaphorical. Ventilation shafts would be the lifelines of such a place, but they could not be simple holes in the ground. They would need to be distributed, disguised and protected. Airflow would have to be regulated so that stale air is removed without creating drafts that signal large voids below the surface. Temperature differences between underground chambers and the outside world could be used to drive passive airflow, reducing the need for constant mechanical intervention. Warm air rises, cool air sinks. A city designed around these principles could breathe slowly, steadily, almost invisibly. Over time, these systems would become more refined. Early designs might rely on trial and error, with certain passages abandoned or reshaped when airflow proved insufficient. Later generations would inherit this accumulated knowledge, not as abstract theory, but as lived experience. They would know which corridors carried fresh air, which chambers needed more circulation, which seasons required adjustments. Breathing would become part of urban literacy. Water presents a different set of challenges. Underground cities cannot rely on rainfall or surface rivers in the usual way. They need secure sources that are protected from contamination and disruption. Aquifers become critical. Natural underground water channels can be tapped, but doing so requires careful management to avoid depletion or collapse. Water must be guided through the city, used efficiently, and returned to the environment without leaving traces that reveal large-scale habitation. This encourages a level of respect for water that surface societies often struggle to maintain. Wastefulness becomes dangerous rather than merely inefficient. Leaks are not minor inconveniences, they are structural threats. As a result, plumbing systems in underground cities would likely be more robust and conservative than their surface counterparts. Every drop would be accounted for. Food production is often assumed to be impossible underground, but that assumption rests on a narrow view of agriculture. While traditional farming depends on sunlight and open land, alternative methods are not only possible but well suited to controlled environments. Mushrooms, root vegetables, algae, and later carefully managed artificial lighting systems could support a stable food supply. Animals might be limited, but not absent. Smaller livestock adapted to enclosed spaces could be integrated carefully. What matters most is predictability. Underground environments are remarkably stable once established. Temperatures fluctuate less, storms are irrelevant, seasons lose their tyranny. That stability makes long-term planning easier, even if it limits variety. Over generations, diets would adapt. Culinary traditions would form around what grows well below ground, just as surface cuisines evolved around local climates. Light is perhaps the most psychologically significant difference. Humans evolved under a sky. Removing that reference point changes how people experience time, space, and themselves. Underground cities would need to replace natural light cycles with artificial ones, not merely for visibility, but for mental health and biological regulation. Day and night would have to be simulated deliberately. This could be done through gradual shifts in lighting intensity and colour, mimicking sunrise and sunset rather than flipping switches abruptly. Communal spaces might brighten during active periods and dim during rest cycles. Private spaces would allow individual control within limits. Over time, residents would internalise these rhythms, The city's light would become the sky they knew. Architecture underground would prioritize function over display, but that doesn't mean it would be crude or joyless. Beauty does not require height. It requires intention. Stone can be shaped smoothly. Walls can carry texture and pattern. Spaces can open unexpectedly into larger chambers that feel expansive despite being enclosed. Sound can be softened through design, reducing echo and creating a sense of calm. Importantly, underground cities would likely grow organically rather than according to rigid master plans. Initial chambers would expand as needed. New corridors would be added to relieve crowding or improve circulation. Over centuries, this would produce layered complexity, not unlike surface cities, but oriented inward rather than outward. Older sections might be repurposed, sealed, or preserved as historical spaces. One advantage of underground construction is durability. Structures carved directly from bedrock do not decay in the same way as surface buildings. They do not suffer from wind erosion, ultraviolet radiation, or freeze-thaw cycles. Maintenance still matters, but the baseline longevity is far greater. This allows a city to think in longer time frames. Buildings are not expected to be replaced every few decades. They are expected to endure. That endurance changes how people relate to space. When your surroundings are stable across generations, history feels present rather than abstract. Children grow up walking the same corridors their grandparents did. Stories are anchored to specific places that have not changed much over time. Memory becomes spatial rather than textual. Sound behaves differently underground as well. Without open air to dissipate it, noise can travel unpredictably. This would likely encourage quieter social norms. Loud, constant activity would be exhausting. Over time, cultural expectations would shift toward moderation. Public spaces would be designed to absorb sound. Private spaces would be insulated. Silence would not be enforced, but it would be valued. Social organization in underground cities would also differ from surface norms. Space constraints would discourage extreme inequality in housing. You cannot build sprawling estates when every chamber requires labor to carve and maintain. Status might still exist, but it would express itself through responsibility rather than excess. Access to knowledge, decision-making roles, or stewardship of critical systems would carry more weight than physical display. Movement through the city would be deliberate. Streets would be replaced by corridors, ramps, and chambers connected in 3 dimensions. Orientation would rely less on visual landmarks and more on familiarity. People would know the city by feel, by the slope of a passage, the sound of airflow, the subtle temperature changes between sections. Outsiders would find it disorienting. Residents would find it intuitive. This naturally limits population growth. Underground cities cannot expand infinitely without destabilizing their environment. Growth would have to be planned carefully. Birth rates might be regulated culturally rather than coercively, with an emphasis on balance rather than expansion. The idea of endless growth, so central to many surface civilizations, would lose its appeal when space itself is finite and shared. Children raised in such environments would develop different instincts. They would be less oriented toward distant horizons and more attuned to immediate surroundings. Their sense of direction would be internal rather than visual. Darkness would not be frightening because it would not mean absence. It would mean rest, privacy, or transition. Education would likely emphasize systems thinking. In a hidden city, everyone depends on infrastructure working correctly. Understanding how air, water, food, and waste systems function would not be abstract knowledge reserved for specialists. It would be common literacy. People would know how their city breathes because their lives depend on it. That shared dependence could foster a strong sense of collective responsibility. When failure has immediate consequences, cooperation becomes non-negotiable. This does not mean harmony at all times. Conflict would still exist. But the incentives would favour resolution over escalation. You cannot afford prolonged internal breakdown when your environment is unforgiving. Over time, underground cities would develop their own myths and narratives. Stories about the surface might persist, but they would lose urgency. The underground world would feel complete in itself. The idea of returning to open skies might feel unnecessary or even undesirable. Why trade stability for exposure? Why invite uncertainty when you have built something that works? From the surface perspective, traces of these cities would be easy to miss. Ventilation outlets could be disguised as natural formations. Water discharge could blend into existing flows. Occasional surface contact might occur through intermediaries, but without revealing scale or location. To the world above, nothing would seem amiss. This invisibility is not accidental. It is the product of learning. Early mistakes would have taught harsh lessons about exposure. Over generations, the city would refine its ability to exist without being noticed. It would learn not only how to breathe, but how to do so quietly. What's striking is that many ancient underground structures already demonstrate partial versions of this knowledge. Complex ventilation systems carved without modern tools, water channels that still function today, spaces that remain structurally sound after thousands of years. These are often treated as anomalies or curiosities rather than prototypes. If an empire committed fully to underground life, it would not need to invent everything from scratch. It would build on existing techniques, scaling them up, refining them, and integrating them into a comprehensive system. What looks like isolated engineering feats from our perspective could be fragments of a much larger, more cohesive project. Living underground would not be an act of hiding forever in fear. It would be an adaptation to a different mode of existence, one that values continuity over conquest, resilience over recognition. A city that learns to breathe underground is not waiting to return to the surface. It is learning how to live without needing it. And once such cities exist, once generations are born and raised within them, the idea of collapse loses its meaning. What collapses is only the surface illusion. Beneath it, life continues, structured, deliberate, and largely unconcerned with whether it is remembered. When a civilization decides that survival matters more than recognition, its relationship with knowledge changes immediately. On the surface, knowledge is often loud. It's announced in public buildings, carved into monuments, proclaimed through laws, symbols, and written records meant to be seen, copied, and spread. Visibility is part of how authority is maintained. If you control knowledge openly, you shape how people think, remember, and act. But once a society chooses to step out of view, that logic no longer applies. Knowledge stops being a performance and becomes a responsibility. In an underground world, knowledge cannot rely on constant rediscovery. There is no room for forgetting how things work and relearning them later through trial and error. Mistakes are costly. Systems are interconnected. Losing even a small piece of understanding can cascade into real danger. Air, water, food, and structural stability all depend on continuity of expertise. As a result, preservation becomes a central cultural function, not an academic one. Stone is the first medium that makes sense in this context, not as decoration, but as memory. Carved spaces last. They resist decay. They don't depend on fragile materials that degrade quickly underground. Instructions etched into walls cannot be erased by moisture or fire in the same way paper can. A chamber itself can be shaped to teach. The slope of a tunnel can encode drainage logic. The width of a passage can reflect airflow requirements. Architecture becomes instructional by design. This kind of knowledge preservation is subtle. It doesn't announce itself as a textbook or a library. Instead, it is embedded in how the environment works. You learn by living in it. A child grows up understanding that certain doors remain closed during specific cycles, not because a rulebook says so, but because the city behaves differently when they are opened. Over time, cause and effect become second nature. Knowledge is absorbed through habit rather than memorization. Silence plays a role as well. Not all information is meant to be spoken constantly. In surface societies, repetition reinforces authority. Underground, repetition can be dangerous if it spreads beyond the intended audience. Some knowledge would be restricted not out of elitism, but out of necessity. The fewer people who know certain details, the lower the risk of exposure or misuse. This doesn't mean secrecy in the dramatic sense. It means selective transmission. Certain systems would be understood broadly. Others would be entrusted to individuals or groups trained from an early age to maintain them. Apprenticeship would matter more than documentation. Skills would be passed hand to hand, watched closely, corrected immediately. Silence here is not absence, it is precision. Time, too, becomes a storage medium. In underground societies, continuity across generations is more valuable than rapid innovation. Progress still happens, but it is cautious. New ideas are tested slowly, integrated carefully, and preserved only if they prove reliable over long periods. Fads have no place. Knowledge that cannot endure is treated with suspicion. This creates a different intellectual culture than the one we associate with empires above ground. Instead of valuing novelty for its own sake, such a society would value robustness. An idea that works consistently for 100 years is more impressive than one that dazzles briefly and fails. Over centuries, this approach produces systems that appear conservative from the outside, but are remarkably resilient. One consequence of this mindset is that written language may become less central than we assume. Writing is useful, but it is also fragile and easy to misinterpret without context. Underground, where context is stable and shared, oral transmission regains importance. Stories, procedures, and explanations can be layered, corrected, and adapted through direct interaction. Memory is reinforced socially rather than stored externally. This does not mean literacy disappears. It means writing is used differently. Instead of sprawling archives meant to impress future readers, records would be concise, functional, and tightly controlled. Redundancy would exist, but not excess. The goal would not be to preserve everything, but to preserve what is essential. Timekeeping itself would likely be encoded in knowledge systems. Without sky to mark days and seasons, underground societies would rely on internal cycles. These cycles would be maintained through shared understanding rather than external observation. Knowledge of when to rest, when to work, when to adjust systems would be synchronized culturally. Losing track of time would not be an inconvenience, it would be a threat. Because of this, knowledge preservation would be inseparable from ritual. Not ritual in a religious sense necessarily, but in the sense of repeated, meaningful actions that reinforce understanding. Checking air shafts at specific intervals, inspecting water channels in prescribed sequences, teaching children not just what to do, but when and why. These routines anchor knowledge in lived experience. Stone, silence, and time together create a system that resists disruption. Stone holds form. Silence limits exposure. Time filters what is worth keeping. This combination makes it difficult for knowledge to be lost quickly, but also difficult for it to spread uncontrollably. That balance is crucial in a hidden society. It also affects how such a civilization would view history. Surface societies often record history to justify themselves. Victories are emphasized. Failures are reframed. Underground, history would be more practical. It would focus on lessons rather than legends. What worked, what didn't, what nearly failed and why. There would be little incentive to glorify past leaders if their decisions did not contribute to survival. Names might matter less than outcomes. Individual achievement would be acknowledged, but not immortalized in stone statues or grand narratives. Memory would be functional. You remember someone because what they did still affects how you live, not because their name is carved somewhere prominent. This could explain why, from the surface perspective, certain advanced knowledge seems to vanish and then reappear later without clear lineage. If knowledge was preserved underground through practice rather than publication, it would not leave a paper trail. When fragments of it resurfaced, perhaps through limited contact or rediscovery, they would look like sudden breakthroughs rather than inherited wisdom. There is also the question of what knowledge would be deliberately abandoned. Not all information is worth preserving. Techniques that rely on surface conditions, expansive resources, or constant growth might be intentionally left behind. Warfare strategies designed for open terrain, monumental architecture meant to intimidate, political structures dependent on spectacle. These would become irrelevant in an underground context. Letting go of such knowledge would not be seen as loss, it would be seen as refinement. Keeping only what serves the new environment reduces cognitive and cultural clutter. Over time, the society becomes highly specialized, not in the sense of narrow expertise, but in alignment between knowledge and lived reality. This alignment also affects how mistakes are treated. In surface societies, errors can be obscured, denied, or blamed on others because the scale is large and responsibility diffuse. Underground, mistakes are harder to hide. Their consequences are immediate and shared. This encourages a culture of accountability that is quiet but firm. Admitting error is less dangerous than repeating it. Over generations, this creates a deep trust in accumulated knowledge. Not blind trust, but confidence earned through consistency. Children grow up seeing systems work. They understand that certain practices exist for reasons that may not always be explained immediately, but are revealed through experience. Skepticism still exists, but it is grounded in respect for what has already proven itself. Time itself becomes a teacher. Knowledge that cannot survive repeated use over decades is discarded naturally. Knowledge that adapts and endures becomes foundational. This slow filtering process produces a body of understanding that is less flashy than surface science, but more deeply integrated into daily life. From our perspective above ground, this kind of preservation is almost invisible. We look for libraries, inscriptions, and written treatises. We search for names and dates. We expect knowledge to announce itself, but an underground civilization would have no reason to leave those markers behind. Its knowledge would live in the shape of its spaces, the rhythm of its routines, and the continuity of its practices. This raises an unsettling possibility. Some of the most advanced understanding humanity has ever achieved may not be lost, but simply inaccessible to us, because it was never meant to be found in the ways we're looking. It was preserved for use, not for discovery. Power behaves very differently depending on whether it is being observed. On the surface, power is performative by necessity. It must be seen to be believed. Authority is reinforced through visibility, through repetition, through symbols that remind everyone who's in charge and why. Laws are proclaimed publicly. Leaders appear in ceremonies. Buildings are designed to impress rather than merely function. Even punishment is often theatrical, not only to correct behaviour, but to demonstrate consequence. When no one is watching, that entire structure begins to loosen. Power no longer needs to announce itself every day to justify its existence. It no longer needs to compete for attention, loyalty, or fear. And without that pressure, it starts to change shape. In a hidden society, power would lose many of the features we instinctively associate with it. There would be no need for spectacle, no banners, no parades, no constant reinforcement of hierarchy through architecture or ritual. This does not mean power disappears. It means it becomes quieter, more procedural and more embedded in function than in display. One of the first things to change would be how authority is legitimized. On the surface, legitimacy often comes from lineage, conquest, or popular recognition. Underground, those sources lose relevance quickly. Lineage matters less when survival depends on competence. Conquest becomes meaningless when there is no external territory to seize. Popular recognition is less volatile when populations are smaller, stable, and closely interconnected. Instead, legitimacy would emerge from reliability. Who ensures the air flows properly? Who maintains water purity? Who resolves disputes without destabilizing the community? Authority would attach itself to responsibility rather than status. This doesn't mean leadership would be egalitarian in the modern sense. Roles would still exist. Decisions would still be centralized where necessary, but power would be justified by outcomes rather than symbolism. This creates a subtle but important psychological shift. When power is visible, people learn to navigate appearances. They learn what to say, when to bow, which gestures signal loyalty. When power is functional, those cues matter far less. What matters is whether things work. If systems fail, authority is questioned immediately, not rhetorically, but practically. In such an environment, incompetence becomes dangerous very quickly. There is less room for leaders who rule through intimidation or inherited privilege alone. Fear may still exist, but it would not be the primary stabilizing force. Fear destabilizes cooperation in enclosed systems. Trust, even cautious trust, becomes far more valuable. Power would also slow down. Surface politics often operate at a frantic pace because visibility amplifies every decision. Mistakes are punished publicly, rivals exploit hesitation, speed becomes a survival trait. Underground, urgency still exists, but it is different. Crises are internal and measurable rather than external and performative. This allows decisions to be made with deliberation rather than haste. Over time, this would change how leaders are selected and trained. Charisma would matter less than consistency. Rhetorical skill would be secondary to systems thinking. Leaders would likely emerge from technical or organizational backgrounds rather than military or ceremonial ones. They would be people accustomed to maintaining balance rather than asserting dominance. This does not mean conflict disappears. Disagreements would still arise. Resources would still be limited. People would still compete for influence. But the forms that competition takes would be constrained by environment. You cannot afford prolonged power struggles when every disruption affects shared infrastructure. Internal collapse is far more dangerous than external challenge in a closed system. As a result, power would likely become more distributed in practice, even if not in name. Critical systems would require redundancy. Knowledge would be shared among multiple individuals to prevent single points of failure. Authority would exist, but it would be layered rather than absolute. Someone might oversee water systems, but not food production. Another might coordinate logistics without controlling education. Power would be compartmentalized to reduce risk. This compartmentalization also protects against tyranny, not because tyranny is morally rejected, but because it is structurally inefficient. A tyrant who disrupts too many systems creates instability that directly threatens their own survival. In a hidden society, self-preservation aligns closely with restraint. Another significant change would be how power relates to time. Surface rulers often think in short cycles, even in ancient contexts. Reigns end. Dynasties fall. Crises demand immediate solutions. Underground, time horizons would extend naturally. Leaders would be expected to think in decades rather than years. Decisions would be evaluated not by how impressive they look now, but by whether they hold up long after the decision-maker is gone. This encourages a form of humility that is rare in visible empires. Not moral humility necessarily, but structural humility. Leaders understand that they are temporary custodians of systems that must outlast them. That understanding changes incentives. You are less likely to gamble recklessly when the consequences will be felt by people you know personally, people who will still be there long after your authority ends. Power without an audience also changes how identity forms around leadership. On the surface, rulers often become symbols. Their personal stories are amplified. Their flaws are excused or exaggerated. Underground, personal myth-making would be discouraged. Individual leaders would fade into institutional memory rather than dominate it. Their actions would matter more than their personalities. This does not eliminate ambition. It redirects it. Ambition would focus on building systems that endure, on being remembered internally as someone who kept things running smoothly, rather than someone who ruled dramatically. Prestige would attach itself to competence and restraint rather than conquest. The absence of an external audience also affects how power handles dissent. Surface empires often suppress dissent harshly, because dissent threatens legitimacy publicly. Underground, dissent would still be uncomfortable, but it would not carry the same existential risk. There is no crowd to sway, no rival empire watching for weakness. Disagreement can be addressed as a problem to be managed rather than a spectacle to be crushed. That doesn't mean dissent would always be welcomed. Stability would remain paramount. But methods of control would likely favour integration over elimination. You cannot afford to waste people in an enclosed society. Every individual represents labour, knowledge and continuity. Power would be incentivised to correct, redirect or absorb dissent rather than destroy it. Another subtle shift involves how power interacts with morality. On the surface, morality is often tied to ideology, religion, or national identity. It is used to justify actions externally. Underground, morality becomes practical. Actions are judged by their impact on collective survival. Ethical frameworks would evolve accordingly, grounded less in abstract principles and more in consequences. This could produce moral systems that feel unfamiliar or uncomfortable to surface observers. Decisions that prioritise long-term stability over individual preference might be normalised. At the same time, gratuitous cruelty would be inefficient and destabilising. The moral landscape would not be kinder or harsher by default, but more tightly bound to outcomes. Power also changes its relationship with secrecy when no one is watching. On the surface, secrecy is often associated with manipulation. Underground, secrecy becomes a form of risk management. Not everyone needs to know everything. Information is shared on a need-to-know basis, not to consolidate power, but to prevent errors and leaks. This kind of secrecy does not require constant enforcement. It becomes habitual. People grow up understanding that some things are discussed only in certain contexts, not because they are forbidden, but because they are delicate. Over time, this creates a culture where discretion is valued more than disclosure. From the outside, such a society might appear authoritarian if glimpsed briefly. There would be rules, routines, and boundaries that feel rigid. But rigidity in structure does not necessarily translate to rigidity in thought. In fact, the opposite may be true. When basic systems are stable, there is more room for internal reflection, learning, and adaptation. The most striking difference, however, is how power responds to failure. On the surface, failure is often hidden, blamed, or spun. Underground, failure is immediately visible through its effects. If air quality drops, everyone feels it. If water systems falter, illness spreads. There is no way to disguise systemic problems for long. This forces power to confront reality continuously. Denial becomes dangerous. Transparency within the system, even if not to the outside world, becomes essential. Leaders who refuse to acknowledge problems quickly lose credibility, not because people rebel, but because cooperation erodes. Over generations, this dynamic would reshape the very concept of power. It would no longer be something you possess. It would be something you perform quietly through maintenance, coordination, and foresight. The most powerful individuals might be the least visible, known primarily through the absence of crises rather than the presence of achievements. This kind of power does not produce legends easily. It produces stability. And stability is boring from a historical storytelling perspective. It does not leave dramatic ruins or epic tales. It leaves continuity. Systems that keep functioning long after the people who built them are forgotten. That may be why, if such societies existed, they left so little behind for us to notice. We look for power where it announces itself. We look for names, monuments, wars, and proclamations. We are not trained to recognize power that expresses itself through silence and persistence. When no one is watching, power becomes less about control and more about care. Not sentimental care, but structural care. Ensuring that what exists continues to exist. Ensuring that change happens slowly enough to be understood. ensuring that mistakes do not compound, and once power takes that form, returning to the surface becomes less appealing. Visibility reintroduces volatility. Attention invites challenge. Spectacle demands escalation. A society accustomed to quiet, functional power would see surface politics as unnecessarily risky, even reckless. This does not mean such a society would be superior or enlightened in some idealized sense. It would have its own blind spots. Insularity could breed stagnation. Excessive caution could slow adaptation. Overconfidence in existing systems could delay necessary change. No structure is perfect, but the absence of an audience fundamentally alters the incentives that drive behaviour. Without the need to appear strong, power can afford to be flexible. Without the need to impress, it can afford to be patient. Without the need to dominate, it can afford to endure. As the story continues, this quiet transformation of power has far-reaching consequences. It shapes how generations grow up understanding authority. It influences how culture evolves when not shaped by conquest or competition. And it raises an important question that lingers beneath everything we've explored so far. If power can exist without being seen, without being recorded, without being remembered by the world above, then how much of human history might be missing, not because it was destroyed, but because it chose not to leave a trace that we would recognise as power at all. For the first generation, the sky would still exist as a memory. People would remember the feel of wind, the way light changed across the day, the unpredictability of weather. They would compare the underground world to what they left behind, even if they believed the choice was necessary. Stories would circulate naturally. Not propaganda, not instruction, just recollection. What the surface smelled like after rain, how shadows moved, how distance felt different when nothing enclosed it. But memory fades faster than architecture. For the generations born underground, the sky would not be something lost. It would be something described. And there is a fundamental difference between those two experiences. Losing something implies comparison. Being born without it removes that reference entirely. The underground would not feel like confinement. It would feel like the world. Children raised without a sky would not grow up looking upward. They would not associate openness with safety or freedom. Their sense of space would be shaped by depth rather than height, by connection rather than horizon. The world would be something you move through deliberately, not something that stretches endlessly beyond reach. This changes how curiosity develops. Surface curiosity often points outward. What's beyond that hill? What's past that sea? What lies over the border? Underground curiosity turns inward. How does this system work? Where does that passage lead? What happens if this changes? Exploration becomes about understanding complexity rather than conquering distance. Light, for these generations, would never have been something taken for granted. It would be intentional, designed, adjusted. The gradual brightening that signals active periods would feel natural, not artificial, because there is no alternative memory to compare it to. Darkness would not imply danger. It would signal rest, transition, privacy. Shadows would not hide threats. They would simply be part of the environment. Time itself would feel different. Without sunrise and sunset, days would not be anchored to celestial cycles. Instead, time would be communal, marked by shared routines. When everyone rests, when everyone works, when systems shift from one state to another. This creates a strong synchronization between individual experience and collective rhythm. A child growing up in such a society would not learn time by looking at the sky. They would learn it by listening, by observing subtle changes in lighting, sound, temperature, and activity. Their internal sense of time would be calibrated to the city itself, not to an external universe. This produces a different relationship with uncertainty. On the surface, the sky represents both possibility and unpredictability. Storms arrive, seasons shift, droughts and floods disrupt plans. Underground, Uncertainty is minimized by design. Variables are controlled, changes are deliberate. That does not eliminate risk, but it changes its character. Risk becomes systemic rather than environmental. If something goes wrong, it is because a system failed or was mismanaged, not because the weather turned against you. This reinforces the importance of responsibility. You cannot blame the sky, you have to fix the problem. Generations born without a sky would likely develop a strong sense of cause and effect. When things change, there is a reason. That reason can usually be found, understood, and addressed. Magical thinking has little room to grow in an environment where survival depends on practical comprehension. This does not mean spirituality disappears, it changes focus. Reverence may attach itself to continuity, to balance, to the invisible processes that keep life stable. Airflow becomes sacred not symbolically, but functionally. Water purity becomes a moral obligation. Neglect is not a personal failure, it is a communal one. Social bonds in such a society would be intense, not necessarily emotionally expressive, but structurally tight. You grow up knowing that your actions affect people you will see every day for the rest of your life. There is no anonymity. There is no disappearing into a crowd and starting over somewhere else. That reality shapes behaviour more effectively than punishment ever could. Children would learn early that cooperation is not optional. This lesson would not need to be enforced harshly, it would be evident. When someone fails to do their part, systems strain. Everyone feels it. Accountability becomes a shared value rather than an imposed rule. Education would reflect this environment. Instead of abstract curricula designed to prepare individuals for unknown futures, learning would be contextual. Children would be taught how their city works before being taught why it works that way. Understanding precedes theory. Systems literacy would be as basic as language. They would know how air circulates through their living spaces. They would understand how water is sourced and purified. They would learn how waste is processed and why certain materials are reused while others are restricted. This knowledge would not be specialised. It would be common sense. As they grow older, some would specialise, of course. Not everyone would maintain the same systems, but everyone would understand enough to recognise when something was wrong. That collective awareness acts as a safeguard against neglect or abuse of power. Identity would also form differently. On the surface, identity is often tied to land, ancestry and visible markers, flags, borders, accents, clothing. Underground, many of those markers lose relevance. Identity becomes more relational. Who you work with, what you maintain, how you contribute. Names may matter less than roles, or rather, names would matter within relationships rather than across history. Being known as reliable would carry more weight than being known widely. Reputation would be local, persistent, and difficult to escape. For generations born without a sky, the idea of expansion would feel abstract. Why would you want more space if space already functions exactly as needed? Why risk instability for growth? The impulse to spread outward, so common in surface civilizations, would feel unnecessary, even dangerous. Stories about the surface would still exist, but they would change over time. Early generations would tell them as lived history. Later ones would tell them as cautionary tales or curiosities. The sky might become symbolic rather than literal, a place of chaos, exposure, unpredictability. Not evil, but unsuitable. This reframing matters. If the surface is remembered primarily as unstable, then remaining underground is not seen as deprivation. It is seen as wisdom, inherited from ancestors who made a difficult but rational choice. There would likely be individuals who feel drawn to the idea of the sky despite never having seen it. Curiosity does not disappear simply because experience changes. Some people would wonder what it feels like to stand in open space, to see distance without walls. But that curiosity would be tempered by cultural memory emphasizing caution. Leaving the underground would not be forbidden necessarily, but it would be framed as serious, a decision with consequences. Training would be required. Preparation would be extensive. Contact with the surface would be treated as exposure rather than exploration. This shapes how courage is defined. Courage would not be associated with conquest or adventure, but with responsibility, taking on difficult maintenance roles, managing critical systems, making decisions that affect long-term stability. Risk-taking for personal glory would be discouraged. Risk-taking for collective survival would be respected. Psychologically, generations born without a sky would likely develop strong internal orientation. They would be less distracted by distant possibilities and more focused on present systems. Attention would be directed toward what can be influenced rather than what can be imagined. This does not make them unimaginative. It makes their imagination practical. They imagine improvements rather than escapes, refinements rather than revolutions. Change is incremental, deliberate, and evaluated over long periods. Relationships with nature would also differ. On the surface, nature is something you are exposed to. Underground, nature is something you manage and integrate carefully. There is respect, but not romanticism. Water, stone, air, and biological systems are partners rather than adversaries or ideals. Death, too, would be experienced differently. Without open landscapes, burial practices would adapt. Memory would be preserved through continuity rather than monuments. Ancestors would be remembered through systems they helped maintain, through routines they established, through lessons that still guide behaviour. This creates a strong sense of temporal depth. You feel connected to past generations not through stories alone, but through shared infrastructure. You live inside their decisions. That awareness shapes humility. You understand that your actions will similarly shape lives you will never meet. For someone born without a sky, the idea that an entire civilization once lived openly under one would feel almost implausible. How did they manage unpredictability? How did they tolerate exposure? Why would they choose spectacle over stability? These questions would seem obvious, not provocative. And this is where the deepest shift occurs. What we consider normal would feel reckless to them. What we consider freedom might feel like vulnerability. What we see as confinement would feel like security. This inversion matters because it reframes the idea of disappearance entirely. For these generations, there is no disappearance. There is only continuity. The surface world fades not because it is rejected emotionally, but because it no longer feels relevant to daily life. Returning to the surface would not feel like reclaiming a lost home. It would feel like entering an unfamiliar environment with unknown risks. Nostalgia would be absent. Curiosity might exist, but it would be cautious. Over centuries, this divergence in lived experience would make reintegration increasingly unlikely. Cultural differences would grow too large. Values would misalign. Communication would be strained. The underground society would not see itself as hidden. It would see itself as complete. From above, this completeness would be invisible. Surface history would continue to tell stories of collapse, dark ages, rediscovery. Meanwhile, entire generations would live and die below, unaffected by those narratives, unconcerned with recognition, oriented entirely towards sustaining what they inherited. And this brings us to a quiet but unsettling realization. If generations can be born, live full lives, and pass on their world without ever seeing the sky, then absence from history does not imply absence from existence. It implies a different relationship with visibility itself. Culture does not stop evolving just because it is no longer on display. In fact, when removed from constant observation, it often changes more profoundly, because it no longer has to explain itself to anyone outside its own boundaries. In a society that lives underground, culture would not freeze in time, nor would it remain a preserved relic of whatever existed before the withdrawal. It would continue to shift, adapt, and reorganize, but it would do so quietly, shaped by necessity rather than fashion, by continuity rather than reaction. In the absence of external pressure, culture loses one of its most destabilizing forces. On the surface, cultural change is often accelerated by contact. Trade, conflict, imitation, and rivalry all push societies to redefine themselves rapidly. New ideas arrive whether they are needed or not. Old traditions are abandoned to keep up, to compete, or simply to appear modern. Underground, that pressure disappears almost entirely. There is no neighbouring empire to impress, no rival culture to outshine, no audience demanding novelty. This does not mean cultural stagnation. It means cultural selectivity. Changes are adopted only when they solve real problems or improve lived experience in measurable ways. Ideas are not valued because they are new, but because they endure. Over time, this produces a culture that feels internally coherent, even if it looks unfamiliar or conservative from the outside. One of the first things to evolve would be language. Language underground would not need to describe vast landscapes, distant horizons, or changing weather in the same way surface languages do. Vocabulary related to sky, distance, and seasons would slowly lose prominence. In its place, language would become rich in terms describing proximity, texture, sound, airflow, and subtle environmental shifts. Words would develop for gradients of light, for variations in stone, for the feeling of enclosed space at different scales. Directions would be described differently as well. Instead of north and south, orientation might rely on functional markers, toward the water systems, away from the old chambers, above the thermal layers, below the living levels. Language would encode the city's structure implicitly, reinforcing spatial awareness through everyday speech. Over generations, this linguistic shift would shape thought itself. People would conceptualize the world as layered rather than expansive, interconnected rather than open-ended. Problems would be approached as matters of balance rather than conquest. Cultural metaphors would draw from flow, pressure, and stability rather than growth, ascent, or dominance. Art would also change, but not disappear. Without open plazas or monumental facades, art would become intimate. It would be integrated into living spaces rather than displayed for crowds. Carvings along frequently travelled corridors. Patterns etched into walls where people pause naturally. Music designed for acoustics that favour resonance over volume. Sound, in particular, would become a powerful cultural medium. Underground acoustics amplify and carry sound differently. Loud, sharp noises travel too far and disrupt too much. As a result, music would favour lower volumes, sustained tones, and controlled resonance. Rhythm would be shaped by breath and heartbeat, rather than by the need to project. Performances would be shared experiences rather than spectacles. Visual art would evolve in response to controlled lighting. Colours would be chosen carefully, knowing exactly how they appear under specific light conditions. Gradients would matter more than contrast. Subtlety would be valued because it rewards attention rather than overwhelming it. Art would not shout, it would invite. Storytelling too would shift. On the surface, stories often revolve around heroes, battles, journeys, and dramatic turning points. Underground, those narratives would feel distant. There are no epic migrations, no sweeping landscapes to cross, no enemies to confront publicly. Instead, stories would focus on choices, consequences, near failures, and recoveries. Cultural memory would preserve moments when systems nearly collapsed, when errors almost compounded into disaster, when restraint prevented catastrophe. These stories would not glorify recklessness. They would honour caution, foresight, and cooperation. The hero would not be the one who acted boldly, but the one who noticed something subtle in time. Rituals would emerge around maintenance rather than dominance. Periodic inspections would take on symbolic meaning. Collective pauses to recalibrate systems would become moments of reflection. These rituals would not be mystical in origin, but they would acquire emotional weight over time. They would remind people that survival is active, not passive. Celebrations would exist, but they would be grounded. Instead of marking conquest or expansion, they might mark stability. Another cycle completed without major disruption. A system upgraded successfully. A generation trained and ready to take responsibility. These are quieter milestones, but they matter deeply in a society where continuity is the ultimate achievement. Social norms would reinforce moderation. Excess would be frowned upon not because of moral doctrine, but because it strains shared systems. Waste would be socially unacceptable. Noise would be moderated by courtesy rather than enforcement. Privacy would be respected because space is shared. Etiquette would evolve to minimize friction rather than display status. Fashion, if it exists at all, would be functional first. Materials would be chosen for durability and ease of repair. Ornamentation would be subtle, personal, and meaningful rather than conspicuous. Clothing might indicate role or expertise rather than wealth. Identity would be signalled quietly, through familiarity rather than assertion. This cultural environment would also influence emotional expression. Underground societies would not necessarily be emotionally repressed, but they would value regulation. Explosive displays of anger or grief would be disruptive in enclosed spaces. Emotional expression would be channeled through conversation, ritual, and shared responsibility rather than through public outburst. Children raised in this environment would learn early how to read subtle cues. Changes in tone, posture, and rhythm would carry meaning. Emotional intelligence would develop alongside technical literacy. Understanding how others are coping would be as important as understanding how systems are functioning. Over time, this would produce a culture that feels inwardly attentive. People would be skilled at noticing small changes, both in their environment and in one another. This attentiveness reduces the need for strict enforcement. Problems are addressed before they escalate. Tensions are resolved early because they cannot be ignored easily. Religion or belief systems, if present, would likely orient around continuity rather than transcendence. The idea of escape to another realm would feel abstract in a society focused on maintaining the one it inhabits. Belief might centre on stewardship, on being part of an unbroken chain rather than seeking individual salvation. Sacredness would attach itself to processes rather than places. The flow of clean water, the stability of air, the passing on of knowledge, these would not be worshipped in a dramatic sense, but they would be treated with reverence. Neglect would feel like sacrilege not because of doctrine, but because of consequence. Cultural change would still occur through generational shifts. Younger generations would question inherited practices, they would test boundaries, they would propose refinements, but the pace of change would be slower and more deliberate. There would be time to evaluate whether an idea improves stability or introduces unnecessary risk. This creates a culture that evolves through accumulation rather than replacement. New practices are layered onto old ones rather than wiping them away. History is not discarded to make room for novelty. It is consulted, adjusted, and extended. From the outside, such a culture would appear static if glimpsed briefly. But longevity often looks like stillness when viewed without context. Change measured in centuries is invisible to those expecting it to happen in years. One consequence of this quiet evolution is that culture becomes deeply local. There is little incentive to standardize beyond what is necessary for system compatibility. Variations would emerge between different underground communities or regions, shaped by geology, available resources, and historical contingencies. These differences would be subtle but meaningful. Because contact between regions would be limited, cultural divergence would not be smoothed out quickly. Traditions would persist, dialects would deepen, local identities would strengthen without becoming competitive. There is no audience to impress, no pressure to conform. This insularity has risks. Innovation can slow, blind spots can persist longer, cultural assumptions can harden into unquestioned norms, but it also protects against volatility. Rapid swings in values, common in surface societies reacting to external shocks, would be rare. Importantly, culture underground would not define itself in opposition to the surface world. Over time, the surface would simply fade from relevance. It would be a reference point in stories, not a standard of comparison. Identity would be built from lived experience, not contrast. This matters because cultures that define themselves against others remain reactive. Cultures that define themselves internally become self-sustaining. They do not need validation. They do not need to prove superiority. They need only to function. As generations pass, this quiet cultural evolution would produce people who are deeply adapted to their environment. Their values would make sense there, even if they appear strange or restrictive from above ground. Their priorities would align with survival, balance, and continuity rather than expansion or legacy. And this brings us to an important realization. Culture does not require visibility to persist. It requires transmission. It requires shared practice. It requires relevance to daily life. All of these can thrive in darkness just as well as in light. If such cultures exist or existed, they would not leave behind dramatic artistic movements or philosophical treatises meant for posterity. They would leave behind functioning systems and people who know how to live within them. That is a quieter achievement, but a profound one. When a society withdraws from view, it does not leave a vacuum. It leaves uncertainty. And uncertainty has a way of filling itself with stories. Above ground, where people rely on shared narratives to explain what they cannot see, myths and rumours begin to grow almost immediately. They are not created out of malice or imagination alone. They are attempts to make sense of absence. When something that once shaped the world no longer does so openly, people look for explanations that fit their own experiences, fears, and expectations. At first, these stories are practical. Traders notice that certain routes are no longer maintained. Travellers find cities quieter than they expected. Officials encounter gaps in communication that used to be reliable. The explanations are mundane: political instability, economic decline, administrative failure. These ideas circulate because they are familiar. They fit the standard pattern of how power ends. But as generations pass and surface societies reorganize themselves around new centers of influence, the old explanations begin to fray. Ruins remain that seem too advanced for the stories told about their builders. Infrastructure exists where no living population appears to require it. Underground spaces are discovered that feel disproportionate to any known use. At this point, explanation shifts from analysis to imagination. Myths begin as questions that no one can answer conclusively. Who built this? Why is it here? Where did they go? Without living witnesses, the answers become flexible. They adapt to local culture, belief systems, and political needs. One region's vanished empire becomes another region's cautionary tale, a warning about hubris, a story about divine punishment, a reminder of what happens when people anger the gods or forget their place. In some cultures, the stories take on a moral tone. The vanished ones are portrayed as arrogant, decadent, or corrupt. Their disappearance becomes a lesson. Do not build too high. Do not challenge the natural order. Do not forget tradition. These narratives say more about the societies telling them than about the ones that vanished. They project contemporary anxieties backward, reshaping the past to validate present values. In other places, the stories become more mysterious than moral. The people who went before are no longer villains. They are sages, giants, or beings of superior knowledge. They did not fall. They transcended. They retreated into the earth, into mountains, into hidden realms beyond ordinary reach. These stories do not condemn the past. They romanticize it. Interestingly, both types of myth often coexist, even within the same culture. The same ancient civilization can be remembered as both dangerously powerful and impossibly wise. This contradiction is not a flaw. It reflects ambivalence. People sense that the official story of collapse does not explain everything. but they do not have the tools or evidence to replace it with something concrete. Rumours function differently from myths, but they serve a similar purpose. Myths are stable, they endure. Rumours are unstable, they shift with circumstance. A shepherd claims to have seen lights where there should be none. A miner reports tunnels that do not match known geology. A traveller hears sounds beneath the ground in places long thought empty. Each account is isolated, easy to dismiss on its own. Together they form a background hum of possibility. Most of these rumours fade quickly. They are laughed off, forgotten, replaced by more immediate concerns. But some persist. They recur across regions and centuries. They follow patterns, stories of hidden people, of doors that open only at certain times, of places where the ground feels hollow, where compasses behave oddly, where sound travels farther than it should. Surface societies tend to treat these stories as folklore. They are categorized alongside tales of spirits, monsters, or lost treasures. This categorization is convenient. It removes the need to investigate seriously. Folklore is not expected to be accurate. It is expected to be symbolic. But folklore often preserves distorted memories of real events. It compresses complex histories into simple images that can survive oral transmission. Over time, details blur, but core elements remain. A hidden population, an underground realm, a sense that something important lies beneath the surface of the ordinary world. What makes these stories particularly resilient is that they do not require proof to function. They offer explanation without demanding verification. For people living above ground, they fill gaps in understanding without threatening existing structures of power. As long as the hidden world remains safely fictional, it poses no challenge. Political authorities have often encouraged this framing, intentionally or not. Acknowledging the possibility of a surviving underground civilization would complicate claims of legitimacy. It would raise uncomfortable questions about continuity, inheritance, and authority. It is far easier to treat the past as definitively over. As a result, stories about what lies beneath are allowed to exist only in forms that cannot be acted upon. They become entertainment, superstition, or spiritual allegory. They are not investigated with the same seriousness as surface history. At the same time, these stories subtly influence culture. They shape how people think about the Earth itself. Underground spaces become associated with mystery, danger, or sanctity. Certain locations acquire reputations. They are avoided, revered, or ritualized. Even without conscious belief, behavior changes. Language reflects this influence. Phrases emerge that associate the underground with secrecy, depth, or hidden truth. To say something is buried is to say it is concealed but not gone. To dig deeper is to seek understanding beyond appearances. These metaphors persist because they resonate with something unresolved. In some traditions, the idea of hidden peoples becomes explicit. Legends speak of civilizations that withdrew beneath the earth to escape catastrophe. Sometimes these beings are described as benevolent guardians, other times as watchers waiting for the right moment to return. The specifics vary, but the structure remains consistent. They did not die. They left. What is striking is how often these stories emphasize choice rather than defeat. The hidden ones are not portrayed as refugees in most versions. They are portrayed as deliberate. They knew something the surface world did not. They saw danger coming. They chose survival over dominance. This narrative aligns closely with the idea of disappearance rather than collapse, even if it is framed mythologically. It suggests an intuitive understanding that something more complex happened than simple failure. People sense that the past may have made decisions that are no longer visible. Over time, these stories become layered. New elements are added to keep them relevant. Religious interpretations overlay older secular ones. Moral lessons are emphasized or softened depending on cultural needs. The core idea persists because it adapts. Rumours also evolve alongside technology. In more recent eras, reports of underground structures become entangled with ideas about secret governments, lost technologies, or hidden power centres. The language changes, but the impulse remains the same. There is a persistent belief that something important operates out of sight. Most of these modern rumours are exaggerated or unfounded, but their popularity reveals a deeper discomfort with surface explanations. People feel that official narratives leave too much unexplained. They sense that history is incomplete, that power may not be where it appears to be. From the perspective of a hidden underground society, these stories would be both useful and irrelevant. Useful because they misdirect attention. If the surface world expects hidden realms to be fantastical, it is less likely to recognise something mundane and functional if it ever stumbles across it. Irrelevant because internal life does not depend on external belief. In fact, myths and rumours above ground could serve as a kind of protective layer. They create noise. They blur the line between possibility and fantasy. They ensure that even accurate observations are dismissed as part of a larger pattern of exaggeration. This is not manipulation in the active sense. It is an emergent effect. When truth is indistinguishable from fiction, neither is pursued rigorously. The hidden remains hidden not because it is perfectly concealed, but because it is not taken seriously. There is also a temporal aspect to these stories. As centuries pass, surface societies change dramatically. Empires rise and fall, languages shift, religions evolve. Each era reinterprets the past according to its own concerns. The stories about what lies beneath are rewritten accordingly. What remains consistent is the sense of continuity interrupted, a feeling that something once central is now absent, but not entirely erased. This feeling is difficult to articulate precisely, which is why it finds expression in narrative rather than analysis. Archaeology occasionally intersects with these myths in uncomfortable ways. Discoveries are made that do not fit neatly into established timelines. Underground complexes are found with levels of sophistication that challenge assumptions. Rather than revising the broader story, these findings are often isolated, labelled anomalous, explained as exceptional rather than representative. This compartmentalization preserves the dominant narrative. It allows surface history to remain coherent, even if incomplete. The alternative would require acknowledging that the past may include intentional absences, not just accidental losses. For most people living above ground, this distinction does not matter day to day. Myths serve their purpose, they entertain, they caution, they inspire. They offer symbolic meaning without demanding practical consequences. But occasionally myths change function. In times of crisis, people revisit old stories differently. They look for precedents, for examples of survival under extreme conditions. The idea of a civilization that withdrew rather than collapse becomes appealing rather than threatening. It suggests that endurance is possible even when the surface world feels unstable. At these moments, myths gain urgency. They are no longer just stories. They are imagined alternatives. What if they knew something we do not? What if there is another way to exist? Most of the time, these questions remain speculative. Life continues. Surface problems demand surface solutions, but the questions do not disappear. They wait. This is the quiet power of stories told above ground. They keep possibilities alive without resolving them. They ensure that disappearance is never fully accepted as final. Even when history declares something over, narrative leaves room for doubt, and that doubt matters. It means that absence is not equated with non-existence. It means that silence is not assumed to be emptiness. It means that the ground beneath our feet remains conceptually alive, not just geologically. These myths and rumours take on a new role. They become the only points of contact between two worlds that no longer interact directly. They are imperfect, distorted, and often misleading, but they are also persistent. They suggest that even if a civilization chose to disappear, it could never fully erase itself from the human imagination. Its shadow would remain, reshaped endlessly by those who live above, telling stories to explain why something so influential seems to have ended so quietly. When people talk about technological progress, they usually imagine a straight line moving forward. Tools become faster, stronger, more efficient. Old systems are replaced rather than refined. New inventions arrive, and whatever came before is labelled obsolete. This way of thinking makes sense in surface societies, where competition rewards speed and visibility. Progress is something you demonstrate. You prove it by outpacing rivals, by producing more, by doing things bigger and louder than before. But once a society removes itself from that environment, the logic behind technology changes completely. When no one is watching, when there is no rival to impress and no market to dominate, technology no longer needs to advance for the sake of advancement. It only needs to work. And more importantly, it needs to keep working. In a hidden underground civilization, endurance would become the primary design principle. Not speed, not novelty, not even maximum efficiency in the short term. Systems would be judged by how reliably they function over decades and centuries, how forgiving they are of error, and how easily they can be maintained by successive generations who did not invent them. This represents a fundamental shift away from what surface cultures usually call progress. Instead of constantly replacing old technology with new, underground societies would refine, simplify, and stabilize what already exists. A system that works well enough and can be repaired indefinitely is far more valuable than one that performs brilliantly but fails catastrophically when it breaks. That mindset would influence every layer of technological development. Materials would be chosen not for peak performance, but for longevity and predictability. Complex components with tight tolerances would be avoided unless absolutely necessary. Designs would favour modularity, allowing parts to be replaced without dismantling entire systems. Redundancy would be built in deliberately, even at the cost of efficiency. On the surface, redundancy is often seen as waste. Why build two systems when one can do the job? Underground, redundancy is survival. If air circulation fails in one section, another must compensate immediately. If a water channel becomes blocked, alternatives must exist. Technology would be designed with failure in mind, not as an exception, but as an expected condition that systems must absorb gracefully. This approach produces technology that looks conservative from the outside. There are fewer radical breakthroughs, fewer dramatic leaps forward. But what is gained is resilience. Systems become deeply understood because they do not change constantly. Knowledge accumulates rather than being reset with each new generation of tools. Maintenance would be elevated to a central technological practice rather than a secondary concern. On the surface, maintenance is often undervalued because it does not produce visible innovation. Underground, maintenance is innovation, finding ways to extend the life of a system to improve its reliability without increasing complexity would be considered a significant achievement. This would also shape how technology is taught. Instead of focusing on invention alone, education would emphasize understanding failure modes, how systems degrade, where they are most vulnerable, how small changes can have large effects over time. Engineers would be trained not just to build, but to anticipate how their work will be used, misused, and inherited. Another consequence of choosing endurance over progress is that technological change slows down. This does not mean stagnation, it means intentional pacing. New ideas would be introduced cautiously, tested in isolated environments, and adopted only after long evaluation. A technology that cannot demonstrate reliability over extended periods would not be widely deployed. This contrasts sharply with surface cultures, where early adoption is often rewarded and failure is tolerated as part of innovation. Underground, failure has higher stakes. A flawed system does not just inconvenience users, it threatens collective survival. As a result, caution becomes a virtue rather than a barrier. Energy systems would reflect this philosophy strongly. Instead of pursuing high-output, resource-intensive solutions, underground societies would favour stable, low-variance energy sources. Systems that produce consistent output over long periods, even if less powerful, would be preferred. Energy storage would be prioritised to buffer fluctuations. Consumption would be tightly matched to production, rather than expanded aggressively. This approach discourages technologies that require constant external input or rare materials. Dependence is a liability when isolation is intentional. Technologies that rely on easily accessible, locally available resources would be favoured. If something cannot be sourced, repaired, or replicated within the underground environment, it becomes a risk. Communication technology would also evolve differently. Without the need to broadcast messages over vast distances, communication systems would focus on reliability and clarity within a known network. There would be little incentive to develop long-range signalling that could reveal location or scale. Instead, internal communication would be optimized for accuracy and redundancy. Data storage presents an especially interesting case. Surface societies often prioritize density and speed. More data stored in smaller spaces accessed instantly. Underground, durability would matter more. Data that degrades quickly or requires constant energy input to preserve would be suspect. Physical storage methods that can survive without active maintenance would retain value. This does not imply a rejection of abstraction or advanced understanding. Underground societies could possess sophisticated theoretical knowledge, but the translation of theory into technology would be filtered through the lens of endurance. An elegant idea that produces fragile systems would remain theoretical. Only ideas that can be embodied reliably would shape daily life. Over time, this creates a technological culture that feels slow but deep. Innovations accumulate gradually. Systems evolve through refinement rather than replacement. Older technologies remain in use alongside newer ones, not because change is resisted, but because reliability has already been proven. There is also an ethical dimension to this technological philosophy. When technology is designed to last across generations, its creators are forced to consider long-term consequences more seriously. Decisions cannot be justified by short-term gain. The people affected by those decisions are not abstract future users. They are known descendants, neighbours, and successors. This fosters a form of responsibility that surface innovation often lacks. Technologists become stewards rather than disruptors. Their role is not to transform society dramatically, but to ensure it continues to function smoothly. Prestige attaches itself to stability rather than novelty. From the outside, this might look like technological regression or stagnation. Observers accustomed to rapid change might interpret the absence of visible innovation as decline. But that interpretation assumes that progress must always be outward-facing and accelerating. In a hidden society, progress is measured by the absence of crisis rather than the presence of new devices. This perspective also changes how failure is recorded. On the surface, failed technologies are often forgotten quickly as attention shifts to the next attempt. Underground, failures would be studied carefully and remembered. They would become part of institutional memory, shaping future decisions. The goal is not to fail faster, but to fail less often. Over centuries, this creates a technological lineage that is remarkably stable. Systems become refined through countless small adjustments rather than dramatic overhauls. Knowledge is layered, not replaced. Each generation inherits not only tools, but an understanding of why those tools exist in their current form. This may explain why certain ancient technologies appear surprisingly advanced yet static. From a surface perspective, it seems strange that a civilization could develop sophisticated engineering and then stop improving it. But if improvement is defined as endurance rather than expansion, then stability is the improvement. Another important consequence is that underground technology would likely avoid extremes. Systems that operate near theoretical limits are efficient but fragile. Systems that operate well within safe margins are forgiving. Forgiveness matters when repair resources are limited, and mistakes have cumulative effects. This philosophy would discourage dependence on technologies that cannot degrade gracefully. A system that fails suddenly and completely is dangerous. One that fails slowly and visibly allows intervention. Transparency of failure becomes a design goal. Over time, this creates an environment where technology and culture are tightly aligned. People trust systems because they understand them. They understand them because the systems do not change too quickly. This trust reduces anxiety and increases cooperation. Technology becomes part of the social fabric rather than an external force. From the surface, occasional fragments of this technology might emerge. Tools or techniques that seem oddly durable. Designs that prioritize simplicity over performance. Methods that appear inefficient by modern standards, but prove extraordinarily reliable. These fragments might be dismissed as primitive or overbuilt, missing the context that explains their purpose. If such a hidden society still exists, or existed for long periods, its technological legacy would not be obvious. It would not leave behind dramatic machines or artifacts meant to impress. It would leave behind systems that quietly did their job until they were no longer needed, or until the society itself chose to change. And that is the key distinction. Technology that chooses endurance over progress does not seek to dominate the future. It seeks to coexist with it. It does not race against time. It settles into it. This challenges one of the core assumptions of surface history, that technological progress is always linear and outward-facing. It suggests that there are alternative trajectories, ones that prioritize continuity over acceleration, reliability over novelty, and responsibility over recognition. As we move forward, this raises a subtle but important question. If a civilization chose technologies that leave little dramatic evidence behind, how would we recognize its presence at all? And if we encountered traces of such technology today, would we interpret them correctly? Or would we mistake endurance for simplicity and overlook the quiet sophistication embedded in systems designed not to be noticed? History likes clean explanations, but the surface of the world is rarely clean. It is layered, reused, eroded, rebuilt, and misunderstood. When something does not fit neatly into an established timeline, it is often smoothed over rather than examined closely. Not because anyone is hiding the truth deliberately, but because uncertainty is uncomfortable, and coherent stories are easier to teach, remember, and defend. This is where the signs begin to slip past us, not hidden, not erased, but quietly reclassified until they stop asking questions. If a civilization chose endurance over visibility, its traces on the surface would not announce themselves as evidence of survival. They would appear as inconveniences to existing explanations, awkward details, anomalies that require footnotes, findings that are labelled rare, unique, or ceremonial to avoid revising broader assumptions. Over time, these signs accumulate not into a clear picture but into a pattern of almost noticing. One of the most common signs is scale without context, structures far larger or more complex than their supposed use demands, tunnels that extend for kilometres where short passages would suffice, chambers carved with precision in places where no long-term population is believed to have lived. These are often explained as religious, symbolic, or defensive, because those explanations do not require sustained occupation. A ritual space can be large without being practical. A defensive tunnel can exist without being lived in. But when these features appear repeatedly across regions and cultures, the explanation begins to feel thin. Another sign appears in infrastructure that seems to anticipate needs that never materialized on the surface. Water channels sized for populations larger than any known settlement in the area. Ventilation systems far more sophisticated than required for storage or burial spaces. Drainage networks that assume continuous use rather than occasional access. These features suggest planning for permanence, not for occasional refuge or ceremony. Yet when such findings are presented, they are often isolated from one another. Each site is treated as an exception. Each discovery is framed as ingenious but singular. The possibility that these structures represent fragments of a larger coordinated system is rarely entertained seriously, because it would require rethinking not just one location, but entire historical narratives. Timing is another subtle indicator. In many regions, surface civilizations appear to lose momentum at roughly the same periods. Construction slows, monumental projects cease, administrative records thin out. At the same time, underground activity where it is visible at all seems to increase. More tunnels, more chambers, more evidence of subterranean modification. These trends are usually treated as unrelated, but the overlap is striking. Surface decline is explained as economic strain or political fragmentation. Underground expansion is explained as defensive behaviour. Both explanations may be partially correct, but together they suggest a coordinated shift rather than coincidence. It is one thing for people to hide underground temporarily during crisis. It is another to invest heavily in subterranean infrastructure while surface systems are being quietly abandoned. Then there are the materials themselves. Certain construction techniques appear suddenly, fully developed, without clear evolutionary stages. Stone blocks fitted so precisely that modern tools struggle to replicate the tolerances. Surfaces polished in environments where such effort seems unnecessary. Load-bearing designs that anticipate stresses long before modern engineering formalize those principles. These techniques often disappear just as abruptly as they appear, leaving no clear line of development. The standard explanation is loss of knowledge, a golden age followed by decline. But that explanation assumes that knowledge must always be passed publicly to survive. It ignores the possibility that knowledge was preserved privately or relocated entirely. If expertise moved underground along with the society that developed it, its absence on the surface would look exactly like loss. Another category of signs comes from geography itself. There are places on Earth where settlement patterns make little sense if viewed only from above, regions with abundant resources that were inexplicably abandoned, areas with harsh surface conditions that nonetheless show evidence of sophisticated planning, locations where later civilizations settled nearby, but not directly on top of earlier ruins, as if something discouraged reuse. Sometimes this is attributed to superstition, sometimes to environmental change. But there are cases where neither explanation fully satisfies. The land remains fertile, the climate stabilizes, and yet the ruins remain oddly untouched, as if their abandonment was intentional and respected, even by those who came later. Language provides quieter clues. Certain words persist across cultures that describe hidden spaces, people below or worlds beneath the surface. These terms often survive even when their literal meanings are forgotten. They become metaphors, idioms, or mythic references. But language tends to preserve what mattered, even when context is lost. Phrases that associate truth with depth, knowledge with what is buried, or danger with hollow ground appear repeatedly across unrelated languages. This does not prove anything on its own, but it suggests a shared conceptual inheritance. Something about what lies beneath was important enough to shape how people thought, long after direct knowledge faded. Maps, too, sometimes whisper rather than shout. Early cartography includes blank spaces, warnings, and symbols in places where later exploration finds extensive underground features. These markings are often dismissed as artistic flourishes or expressions of ignorance. But they could also reflect knowledge that was intentionally vague. Not every map is meant to guide. Some are meant to discourage. There are also the signs that appear in technological mismatches, tools found in contexts that do not align with accepted timelines, techniques that seem out of place for the era in which they are discovered. These are often explained as isolated genius or accidental innovation. The idea that they could be imports from a hidden continuity is rarely considered, because it feels too speculative. Even when surface societies rediscover underground spaces, their interpretations are constrained by expectations. A tunnel is assumed to be a mine, a chamber is assumed to be a tomb, a complex network is assumed to be defensive. These categories limit inquiry. Once something is labelled, investigation stops at the boundary of that label. What is rarely asked is whether these spaces were lived in extensively, not visited, not used occasionally, lived in. The difference matters. Habitation leaves different traces than storage or ritual, where patterns, modifications over time, signs of repair rather than initial construction. In some underground sites these indicators exist, but they are often downplayed or explained away. Another sign lies in what surface societies did not inherit. Certain administrative practices vanish entirely. Legal systems collapse without clear successors. Organisational methods that were once widespread leave little trace in later cultures. This is unusual. Most systems, even when empires fall, leave descendants. They are simplified, adapted, or repurposed. Complete disappearance suggests relocation rather than erosion. Population genetics can also hint at quiet movement. Sudden changes in genetic markers without corresponding evidence of invasion or mass death suggest migration. But migration to where? When there is no clear destination above ground, the data becomes puzzling. Underground migration would leave exactly this kind of gap. People would vanish from surface records without appearing elsewhere. Surface histories tend to explain such gaps as assimilation. The people blended in. They became part of other groups. Sometimes that is true, but assimilation usually leaves cultural traces, names, practices, technologies. When these are absent, the explanation weakens. There are also behavioural signs in later surface civilizations that feel oddly inherited. An instinctive caution around certain places. Traditional prohibitions against digging too deep in specific regions. Stories warning of consequences for disturbing the ground. These taboos are often dismissed as superstition, but they could be cultural echoes of boundaries that once mattered for practical reasons. It is important to note that none of these signs point clearly in one direction on their own. Each can be explained conventionally. That is why they are almost noticed rather than fully recognised. The human mind prefers explanations that preserve existing frameworks. Revising the framework itself is cognitively expensive. Taken together, however, these signs form a different picture. Not of a vanished civilization that failed, but of one that disengaged carefully. Not of knowledge lost, but of knowledge relocated. Not of collapse, but of transition. Surface history is biased toward what interrupts it dramatically. Wars, plagues, revolutions. Quiet endurance does not register as an event. It leaves no obvious timestamp. It does not announce itself with ruins or mass graves. It simply continues elsewhere. This makes it especially hard to detect. By the time surface societies are advanced enough to notice inconsistencies, they are already committed to narratives that exclude the possibility of hidden continuity. Evidence that contradicts those narratives is treated as noise rather than signal. There is also a psychological barrier. The idea that a civilization could choose to leave the surface and succeed in doing so challenges deeply held assumptions about progress, dominance, and visibility. It suggests that survival does not require being seen. That power does not require recognition. That history, as recorded, may not be the whole story. Most people do not want to entertain that idea seriously, because it destabilizes trust in the completeness of knowledge. It implies that what we know is partial by design, not just by accident. That is an unsettling thought, and yet the signs persist, in the way underground structures outlast surface ones, in the way certain technologies appear prematurely and then vanish, in the way myths cluster around specific geographies, in the way absence feels intentional rather than chaotic. We almost notice because we were looking for endings, not continuities. We were trained to see disappearance as failure, not strategy. We were taught that progress moves upward and outward, not inward and downward. If a civilization chose to step away from the surface world deliberately, It would not leave a single clear marker announcing that choice. It would leave exactly what we see instead. A world that appears to move on. A past that seems to end too neatly. A collection of signs that make sense individually, but feel uneasy when placed side by side. And this is where the story becomes more complicated. Because if such signs exist, and if they have been overlooked rather than erased, then the question is no longer whether the surface world missed something. The question becomes whether it was meant to. That question shifts from evidence to implication. What would it mean for the present if the past is not finished? What would it mean if endurance was chosen quietly, and the surface world has been telling itself stories of collapse ever since? And most importantly, what would happen if the signs we almost notice begin to align in ways that are harder to ignore, not as proof, but as a growing sense that history may have gone underground long before we thought to look? The idea of return carries weight because it assumes unfinished business. When people imagine a hidden civilization coming back to the surface, they usually picture an event, an emergence, doors opening, knowledge revealed, a dramatic moment where the past collides with the present and everything changes at once. That expectation comes from surface history, where change is often loud, disruptive, and impossible to ignore. But if a society chose disappearance precisely to avoid volatility, then return, if it ever happened, would not resemble an arrival. It would resemble a disturbance, and not necessarily one they would welcome. To understand what would happen if they returned today, it helps to first question what return even means. Returning to what? To a surface world that no longer resembles the one they left. To political systems built on visibility and speed. To cultures shaped by constant competition, expansion, and reaction. To environments strained by scale in ways that might appear reckless to those who chose endurance instead. From the perspective of a hidden society, the surface world would not feel like home reclaimed. It would feel like an unfamiliar system operating under assumptions they deliberately rejected. The longer the separation, the greater that gap becomes. The first thing they would notice is noise. Not just sound, but informational noise. The constant churn of signals, demands, alerts, and narratives competing for attention. Surface societies are saturated with messaging. Authority is asserted continuously. Identity is broadcast. Conflict is amplified. To a culture accustomed to quiet functional power, this would feel chaotic rather than dynamic. They would also notice fragility. Systems that appear impressive but rely on constant input and rapid correction. Technologies that perform extraordinarily well under ideal conditions but fail abruptly when stressed. Infrastructure optimized for efficiency rather than resilience. From an endurance-focused perspective, much of modern surface technology would look overextended, not advanced. This does not mean they would see the surface world as primitive. Quite the opposite. They would recognize sophistication, but it would be a different kind of sophistication, one oriented toward acceleration rather than balance. They would likely perceive a civilization that has solved many problems brilliantly in the short term while struggling to manage long-term consequences. The social landscape would be equally alien. Surface societies are large, mobile, and loosely connected. Individuals move frequently. Relationships are often temporary. Accountability is diffused across institutions rather than embedded in daily interaction. This produces flexibility, but it also produces disconnection. A society shaped by generations of close interdependence would find this disorienting. The idea that someone could disrupt a system and then simply leave, without facing long-term consequences from the same community, would feel strange. Not immoral necessarily, but structurally unstable. If a hidden civilization were to return openly, even partially, it would immediately become an object of projection. Surface societies would not meet it neutrally. They would interpret it through existing frameworks. Some would see it as a threat, others as a resource, others as a miracle, a warning, or a weapon. Political systems would respond first because visibility triggers power calculations. Who controls this? Who benefits? Who is excluded? The presence of a technologically and culturally distinct society would destabilize existing balances, even if that society had no intention of interfering. Attempts would be made to classify them: nation, corporation, religion, threat actor, ally. None of these categories would fit well, but surface systems require classification to function. Ambiguity is intolerable at scale. The hidden society would quickly realize that simply being seen creates obligations they may not want. To explain themselves, to justify their existence, to respond to demands, to participate in conflicts not of their making. Remaining silent would not be an option once discovered. Silence in the surface world is interpreted as hostility, secrecy, or weakness. This alone would make return unlikely. A society that learned to survive by avoiding attention would recognize that attention itself is corrosive. It accelerates change. It invites intervention. It forces decisions to be made faster than systems can absorb them. Even benevolent engagement would be risky. Sharing knowledge, for example, sounds appealing in theory, but knowledge does not enter a vacuum. It enters competitive systems. Techniques designed for endurance could be repurposed for dominance. Technologies meant to stabilize could be scaled irresponsibly. Ideas about restraint could be ignored in favor of extraction. Once knowledge leaves its original context, control is lost. A hidden society that preserved knowledge through silence would understand this better than anyone. They would be acutely aware that sharing selectively is almost impossible once visibility is established. Cultural misunderstanding would compound the problem. Surface observers would interpret underground values through familiar lenses. Caution might be mistaken for arrogance, silence for manipulation, refusal to engage for hostility. Meanwhile, the hidden society might interpret surface behavior as recklessness or aggression, even when none is intended. Trust would be difficult to establish because expectations would not align. Surface societies often expect progress to mean expansion, growth, and visible improvement. A civilization that values endurance over progress would not conform to those expectations. It would resist being optimized, scaled, or integrated. There is also the psychological impact on individuals from the hidden society. Generations raised without a sky, without constant exposure to open environments and crowds, would find the surface overwhelming. Sensory overload would be real. The lack of controlled rhythms, the unpredictability of weather, the sheer scale of movement and noise. Adaptation would be possible, but it would take time, and time is rarely granted when something new appears on the surface world stage. Curiosity would quickly turn into pressure, pressure into demands, demands into conflict. From the surface perspective, the return of such a civilization would challenge foundational assumptions. History would need revision. Narratives of collapse would unravel. The idea that progress follows a single visible path would be destabilized. This kind of disruption does not stay academic. It affects identity, legitimacy, authority. Institutions built on inherited stories would resist that disruption, not necessarily out of malice, but out of self-preservation. Acknowledging a hidden continuity would raise questions about who has the right to rule, to define history, to control knowledge. Those questions threaten stability. Public reaction would be fragmented. Some would welcome return as hope, proof that endurance is possible. Others would fear it as an indictment of surface civilization's choices. Still others would dismiss it as deception, conspiracy, or fabrication. In a world saturated with misinformation, truth does not automatically prevail. It competes. The hidden society would quickly realize that return is not a neutral act. It changes the surface world simply by existing within it. Even doing nothing becomes a statement. Avoiding influence becomes impossible once influence is assumed. There is also the question of internal consequence. Returning would alter the hidden society itself. Exposure to surface culture would introduce pressures it deliberately avoided. Internal cohesion could erode. Values shaped by isolation might fracture under scrutiny and temptation. Returning risks destabilizing not only the surface but the hidden world as well. For a civilization built on continuity, this is a serious risk. Survival has been achieved by minimizing volatility. Return maximizes it. This suggests that if return were ever considered, it would not be sudden or complete. It would be incremental, indirect, and plausibly deniable. Influence rather than appearance. Observation rather than declaration. Small interventions, subtle contributions. Knowledge seeded quietly rather than revealed openly. Ideas introduced without attribution. Techniques rediscovered rather than delivered. This kind of return does not announce itself as return at all. It blends. From the surface perspective, nothing dramatic happens. There is no arrival, no unveiling, only gradual shifts. New ways of thinking that seem to emerge organically. Technologies that emphasize resilience over speed. Cultural movements that question growth for its own sake. If such influence were occurring, it would be almost impossible to trace. It would look like internal evolution, and that is precisely why it would be effective. It would avoid triggering defensive responses. It would not demand recognition. Of course, this raises the uncomfortable possibility that return does not require presence, that a civilization does not need to reveal itself to affect the world above. It only needs patience and understanding of surface dynamics. But even this form of engagement carries risk. Surface societies are unpredictable. They amplify ideas in unintended directions. A concept introduced quietly can be scaled irresponsibly. A technology meant to stabilize can be weaponized. The hidden society would have to weigh every potential influence against the possibility of harm. This calculation becomes harder as surface conditions become more volatile. Crises invite shortcuts. Desperation invites exploitation. In such contexts, even well-intentioned contributions can be misused. All of this points to a sobering conclusion. If a hidden civilization existed, and if it survived precisely because it avoided the surface world's cycles, then returning today would be more dangerous than remaining hidden. Not because the surface world is hostile by nature, but because it operates on incentives incompatible with endurance-first thinking. Visibility accelerates everything. Attention distorts intent. Power attracts challenge. From their perspective, the surface world may not yet be stable enough to interact with safely. Or it may never be. The criteria for return would not be curiosity or opportunity. It would be alignment, shared values around restraint, sustainability, and long-term thinking. Until such alignment exists, return would feel less like reunion and more like exposure. For those living above ground, this idea is unsettling. It suggests that if someone did choose to disappear for good reasons, their absence today is not indifference. It is caution. It implies that the question is not whether they would return, but whether we have created conditions that make return sensible at all. And that shifts the story away from revelation and toward reflection. Instead of asking when they might come back, the more meaningful question becomes what kind of world would make return unnecessary, or safe, or even welcome. The idea that the past is gone feels natural because it gives history an ending point. It allows us to place events behind us, to draw a line and say that whatever happened before no longer has agency in the present. This way of thinking is comforting. It suggests that we inherit the results of history but not its intentions, that the past shaped us but no longer watches, waits, or adapts. It is finished, archived, resolved. Yet that assumption rests on a very specific model of how societies behave. It assumes that when conditions become unfavourable, civilizations either transform publicly or collapse visibly. It assumes that continuity requires exposure, and it assumes that time moves in a single direction, carrying everything forward whether it wants to go or not. If a civilization chose to disappear instead of fall, those assumptions begin to weaken. The past stops being a closed chapter and starts behaving more like a parallel layer, not influencing the present openly, not competing with it, but existing alongside it, shaped by different incentives and expectations. In that case, the past is not gone. It is waiting. Waiting does not imply intention in a dramatic sense. It does not require a plan to return or a desire to reclaim influence. Waiting can simply mean persisting under conditions that make visibility unnecessary or undesirable. A seed waits underground not because it is plotting emergence, but because the environment above is not yet suitable for growth. When we look at history through this lens, certain patterns begin to feel less like endings and more like pauses. Entire systems cease to interact with the surface world, but their internal logic remains intact. They stop leaving records where we expect to find them, but they do not show signs of disintegration. The machinery does not break, it simply disengages. This reframing changes how we interpret historical silence. Silence is usually treated as absence. If records stop, if artifacts no longer appear, if cultural markers fade, we assume the people who produced them are gone. But silence can also be deliberate. It can be a boundary rather than a void. In everyday life, people go silent for many reasons that have nothing to do with disappearance. They stop speaking publicly when they no longer wish to participate. They retreat from visibility when it becomes unsafe or unproductive. They preserve their lives and values privately while allowing others to assume they no longer matter. Scale that behaviour up to a civilization, and the concept becomes unsettling, but not illogical. The past might be waiting because it does not recognise the present as stable enough to engage with. Surface societies move quickly, reorganising themselves constantly. Institutions rise and fall within lifetimes. Values shift dramatically across generations. From an endurance-focused perspective, this volatility would not inspire confidence. It would encourage caution. Waiting, in this sense, is not passive. It is active restraint. It is the decision to maintain continuity internally while withholding participation externally. The past waits not because it is weak, but because it has learned that survival sometimes depends on patience rather than action. This patience would reshape how such a civilization understands time. Surface cultures experience time as a series of turning points, revolutions, discoveries, crises. Each moment feels decisive. Underground, time would feel more cyclical and less urgent. Systems are designed to absorb stress rather than react explosively. Change happens slowly enough to be understood before it spreads. From that perspective, the present above ground might look perpetually premature, always in the middle of something, always reacting, always convinced that the current moment is exceptional. A civilization accustomed to long continuity would not see these conditions as an invitation to re-emerge. It would see them as confirmation that withdrawal was wise. This helps explain why the past, if it persists somewhere unseen, would not feel compelled to announce itself. Announcement invites response. Response invites entanglement. Entanglement invites risk. Waiting avoids all three. It also explains why the surface world experiences the past as incomplete rather than entirely absent. Ruins remain, myths persist, technologies appear and vanish. These are not messages left deliberately, but residues of disengagement. The surface world encounters the edges of something it cannot fully access, and interprets those edges as endings. We are accustomed to thinking that if something mattered, it would leave a clear mark. That importance correlates with visibility, but importance within a closed system does not require external validation. A civilization that values continuity over recognition would not measure success by how well it is remembered. This is where modern discomfort enters the picture. Our current relationship with history is deeply tied to documentation. We trust what is recorded, catalogued and archived, If something is not written down or preserved in accessible form, we struggle to treat it as real. But documentation itself is a cultural practice, not a universal necessity. A hidden society would not document itself for outsiders. It would document what it needs for itself, in forms that may not survive or translate well above ground. The absence of familiar records does not imply absence of structure or memory. It implies a different audience. Waiting also implies selectivity. Not everything is worth reintroducing into the present. Knowledge preserved underground would be evaluated constantly against its potential impact. Some ideas might remain contained indefinitely, not because they are dangerous, but because they do not align with surface incentives. Ideas about restraint, for example, do not thrive easily in competitive environments. From this angle, the past is not waiting for a moment of triumph. It is waiting for compatibility, for conditions under which engagement would not immediately distort intent. That may never happen, or it may happen gradually without ceremony. This idea challenges one of the most deeply ingrained beliefs of surface history, that the present is always more advanced than the past. Advancement is often equated with speed, scale, and complexity, but endurance follows different metrics: stability, reliability, intergenerational coherence. By those measures, the present may appear unfinished rather than superior. If a civilization optimized for endurance observed the modern surface world, it might see extraordinary ingenuity paired with extraordinary fragility, systems operating near capacity, technologies dependent on uninterrupted inputs, social structures stretched thin by scale. From that perspective, engagement would not feel like progress, it would feel like exposure. The past might also be waiting because it understands something the present struggles with, that collapse is not always loud. Sometimes it is slow, masked by activity. Surface societies can be very busy while becoming less stable. Motion can obscure deterioration. Growth can hide imbalance. Waiting allows a civilization to avoid being pulled into that dynamic. It avoids being forced to choose sides in conflicts that arise from short-term incentives. It avoids becoming a symbol, a weapon, or a target. It avoids being interpreted through frameworks it did not choose. This does not require cynicism about the surface world. It requires realism about how systems behave under attention. Attention accelerates. Acceleration amplifies error. Error compounds. A society that survived by slowing everything down would be reluctant to step into that feedback loop. There is also a moral dimension to waiting that is easy to overlook. Intervention carries responsibility. If a hidden civilization intervened openly in surface affairs, it would influence outcomes it cannot fully control. It would bear some responsibility for the consequences, even unintended ones. Waiting avoids that moral burden. This restraint might appear cold from the outside, but from within, it could be understood as respect for autonomy. The surface world must solve its own problems in ways that align with its values. External solutions, especially from a civilization with radically different incentives, could undermine that process. Waiting does not mean indifference. Observation could still occur. Learning could still happen. The hidden society could adjust internally based on what it observes above ground, refining its own practices, avoiding mistakes others make. In this way, the past continues to evolve, even while remaining unseen. This is another uncomfortable implication. The past, if it persists, is not frozen. It is not a museum. It is not static. It is adaptive. That means it cannot be accessed as a relic. It cannot be studied like an artifact. It would be contemporary in its own context, shaped by centuries of decisions made out of view. From the surface, we tend to treat the past as simpler than the present, less nuanced, less informed. Waiting complicates that view. A society that endured by withdrawing may have accumulated insights about human behaviour, system design, and long-term stability that surface cultures have not yet internalised. This raises a subtle but profound question. If the past is waiting rather than gone, then history is not a straight line behind us. It is layered beneath us. Multiple temporalities coexisting, different versions of humanity experiencing time differently, guided by different priorities. In that case, progress is not universal, it is contextual. What looks like advancement in one layer may look like regression in another. What feels urgent above ground may feel irrelevant below. There is no single vantage point from which to declare an era superior. Waiting also reframes the idea of legacy. Legacy on the surface is about remembrance, names preserved, stories told, achievements recorded. Underground, legacy would be about continuity, systems that still function, practices that still make sense, people who still live well because of decisions made long ago. From that perspective, the past has already succeeded if it is waiting. It has achieved what it set out to do: survival without exposure, continuity without dominance, existence without explanation. This success would not feel triumphant. It would feel normal, every day. The past would not think of itself as the past. It would think of itself as present, ongoing, complete. That is perhaps the most difficult shift for surface thinking to make. We assume that anything that predates us must be less current, less relevant. But relevance depends on alignment, not chronology. A system that works well today is relevant regardless of when it began. If the past is waiting, it is waiting on conditions rather than on us. Conditions that minimize harm, conditions that value restraint, conditions that do not immediately turn everything into spectacle or leverage. Those conditions may never arise, or they may emerge slowly, unevenly, without clear markers. They may not announce themselves as readiness. They may simply feel like a gradual shift in priorities. Less obsession with growth, more attention to balance, less emphasis on visibility, more respect for endurance. If that happens, return would not be a moment. It would be a convergence. The surface world would begin to resemble, in some ways, the values that made withdrawal viable in the first place. At that point, the distinction between return and influence would blur. Until then, waiting remains the safer option. For those of us above ground, this idea invites reflection rather than speculation. It asks what kind of future we are building, and what it signals to any civilization, past or present, that values survival over recognition. It asks whether our systems reward patience or punish it, whether we equate progress with acceleration or with stability. If the past might be waiting rather than gone, then the story is not about uncovering secrets or forcing revelation. It is about compatibility, about whether the present is capable of sustaining the kind of continuity that does not require disappearance. The past does not need to knock on the door to remind us it exists. It only needs to keep waiting, while the surface world decides, one way or another, whether it is learning the same lesson that disappearance once made unavoidable. There is something deeply ingrained in how we tell stories about empires. They rise, they dominate, they fracture, and they fall. That arc feels so natural that we rarely stop to question it. It mirrors human life: birth, growth, decline, death. We apply it instinctively to civilizations, as if complexity must obey the same rhythm as biology. When an empire disappears from view, we reach for the word fallen, because it fits the pattern we expect. But patterns can be habits rather than truths. If everything explored so far is allowed to sit quietly for a moment, a different picture begins to form. Not a dramatic one, not a revelation that overturns history overnight. Something much subtler. The possibility that one of humanity's greatest empires did not end in ruin or defeat, but in rest. Not rest as in inactivity, but rest as in withdrawal from strain. A deliberate easing away from forces that made visibility dangerous. Rest is not the opposite of power. In many systems, rest is what preserves power. Muscles recover through rest. Ecosystems stabilize through dormant periods. Even machines are designed with downtime in mind. Constant operation leads to breakdown. Stepping back extends lifespan. An empire that understood this would not view rest as surrender. It would view it as recalibration. To rest as a civilization would mean redefining success. No longer measured by territory controlled, enemies defeated, or monuments raised. Instead, success would be measured by continuity, by whether people remain fed, sheltered, educated, and capable of maintaining their world without escalating effort. It would mean choosing sustainability over momentum. From the outside, this kind of rest would be indistinguishable from disappearance. Armies would withdraw, borders would dissolve, public institutions would fade. The symbols we associate with empire would vanish, because symbols exist to be seen, and rest does not require an audience. But beneath that absence, life would continue, organised, intentional, focused inward rather than outward. The empire that never fell would not think of itself as an empire anymore. That word carries connotations of dominance and expansion that no longer apply. Internally, it might think of itself simply as a society, a network of people maintaining systems that work, a lineage of decisions oriented toward minimizing harm rather than maximizing reach. This internal reframing matters. Once a society stops identifying with its former surface identity, it no longer experiences disappearance as loss. The past becomes background, useful knowledge is retained, outdated ambitions are discarded, the emotional weight of former glory fades. What remains is function. That function would not be static. Rest does not mean freezing in time. It means operating within sustainable limits. The society would still adapt. Technologies would still be refined. Cultural norms would still evolve. But all of it would happen at a pace that allows consequences to be understood before they compound. In this sense, resting is not passive. It is disciplined. Surface history tends to celebrate moments of action, conquests, revolutions, discoveries. Rest rarely earns admiration because it does not produce spectacle. But in complex systems, rest is often what prevents collapse. The absence of drama is not evidence of failure. It is often evidence of success. If such an empire rested underground for centuries, it would experience time differently than surface societies. While empires above rose and fell, fought wars, expanded and fragmented, the resting society would observe cycles repeating. Patterns would become clear, the same mistakes made in new forms, the same incentives producing the same outcomes. This long view would reinforce the decision to remain withdrawn. Why re-enter a system that continues to reward instability? Why expose carefully balanced structures to forces that have not changed fundamentally? From below, the surface world would appear energetic but exhausting, innovative but fragile, capable of astonishing achievements and equally astonishing self-destruction. The resting empire would not feel superior. It would feel cautious. It would recognize that surface societies value speed and scale because they are visible and measurable. Underground, visibility is irrelevant. Measurement is internal. A system either works or it doesn't. It either preserves life or it fails. This difference in metrics creates a divergence that widens over time. After enough generations, the resting empire would no longer see itself as an alternative version of the surface world. It would see itself as something else entirely. A different answer to the question of how humans can live together. That answer would not be universally applicable. What works underground does not scale infinitely. It does not translate cleanly to open landscapes and massive populations. The resting empire would understand this. Its way of life would not be framed as superior, only suitable for its conditions. This understanding would further discourage return. There is no mission to spread, no ideology to export, no desire to convert the surface world to underground values. Resting is not evangelism. The surface world, however, would continue telling stories about collapse, about dark ages, about lost knowledge. These stories would serve surface needs. They would explain why continuity was broken. They would reinforce the belief that visibility is inevitable and disappearance is failure. The resting empire would not correct these stories. Correction requires engagement. Engagement requires exposure. Exposure reintroduces risk. Silence remains the safer option. This silence would not be empty. It would be full of life, routines, debates, disagreements, innovations, and quiet achievements. It would simply not translate into the forms of evidence surface historians are trained to recognise. From our perspective, this is unsettling. We like the idea that the past is finished, that we are standing at the far edge of a long line of progress. The notion that a civilization could step aside and continue elsewhere disrupts that linear comfort. It suggests that history might be layered rather than sequential. It also suggests that our current moment is not necessarily the most advanced, but merely the most visible. The empire that never fell would not define itself by what it avoided. It would define itself by what it preserved. People who knew how to live without exhausting their environment. Systems designed to be repaired rather than replaced. Knowledge transmitted through practice rather than proclamation. Over centuries, this would produce a society that feels complete in itself, not utopian, not flawless, but coherent, aligned with its constraints, free from the pressure to constantly justify its existence to outsiders. Rest, in this sense, becomes a form of wisdom, knowing when to stop pushing, knowing when to withdraw before damage becomes irreversible, knowing that survival does not always require confrontation. If such an empire exists or existed, it would not see itself as waiting impatiently. It would not count the days until return. It would simply live. From above ground, that life would be invisible, but its absence would still shape us indirectly, in the myths we tell, in the discomfort we feel around unexplained ruins, in the persistent sense that something in history ended too neatly. Perhaps that discomfort is not evidence of mystery, but of misclassification. We labelled rest as collapse because we did not recognise rest as a valid outcome. This reframing changes how we might think about our own trajectory. If disappearance can be a choice rather than a failure, then visibility is not the only path forward. Not every solution needs to be larger, faster, louder. Sometimes the most resilient response to complexity is simplification. Sometimes the strongest move is to step back. The empire that never fell would not judge the surface world harshly. It would recognise itself in earlier versions of it. Ambitious, creative, restless. It would remember being there. Its decision to rest would not be a rejection of humanity, but an expression of it. An acknowledgement of limits. An acceptance that endurance requires restraint. And if it remains hidden, it does so not out of fear, but out of alignment with what it values. Stability over recognition, continuity over conquest, function over form. For those of us listening from the surface world, this idea does not demand belief. It does not require us to accept that such an empire exists beneath our feet. What it offers instead is a different lens. A way of questioning assumptions about history, progress, and success. It asks whether falling is truly the only alternative to rising, whether disappearance must always mean loss, whether rest can be an endpoint that is not an ending. As these thoughts settle, there is no need to resolve them, no need to decide what is true. Like many things worth considering slowly, they are better left open, allowed to drift and connect quietly with other ideas. History does not always shout when it changes direction. Sometimes it lowers its voice, sometimes it steps aside, sometimes it rests. And whether or not any empire ever did exactly that, the possibility itself lingers, not as a secret waiting to be uncovered, but as a reminder that endurance does not always look the way we expect.